all here. And so I'm going to start. Wait a minute. I'm trying to put my screen on, my video on. Now it is. Okay. We are pleased to welcome Robin King to our new panel discussion on land-based finance into urban policy for the new urban agenda. Let me introduce Robin. Robin is the Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at the World Resources Institute Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. In this role, she promotes collaboration across World Resources Institute international network to better integrate urban planning, land use, and sustainable transportation, using her experience working in policy matters in Asia and in the Americas. Robin's contributions to these topics are being instrumental in advancing the agenda of sustainable urban development, and her participation in this panel discussion promises to enrich and moderating the panel to enrich our understanding of how land value capture can be leveraged to create more resilient, equitable, and livable cities. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Robin, and I give the floor to her, who should be presenting the group of experts that were very kind to join us today to share their experiences and insights. So welcome, Robin, and the panel. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for inviting me and all of these great experts to join this panel. I wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the panel, then I'll introduce each of the speakers, and very, very briefly, because if I talked about their whole bios, it would take up the whole time that we've got. And then I will share the longer bios in the chat. And we'll then have presentations of about 15 minutes each from 3 presenters. We'll have a moderated exchange of ideas for about 20 minutes that will also include some space for questions from the audience if you want to put them in the chat. And then we'll have closing remarks of 2 to 3 minutes each from each of the panelists talking about sort of their key takeaway and or a call to action in terms of advancing land-based finance globally. So that's that's the structure. We've got really amazing panelists with a very wide range of experiences in many different countries and at different levels of development that I think will lead to a useful and interesting panel. First, we're going to start with Helen Rourke, who's the program director at the Development Action Group that's based in Cape Town, South Africa. She has many years of experience in the urban development sector and really focuses on affordable housing, neighborhood regeneration, informal settlement upgrading, and land value capture. And she wants to ensure that we really address spatial inequality in cities through innovative partnerships. Next, we'll have Geoffrey Payne, who is a housing and urban development specialist too, with many decades working around the world. And he is the co-author of the 2019 UN Habitat Report on the role of land in achieving adequate and affordable housing, and also has more recent books and many articles and books sort of throughout his career. And last but not least, we have Carlos Zeballos Velarde, who's the co-director of the Sustainability Commission of the UIA, the National Director of Technological Affairs of the College of Architects of Peru, and who's trained both in architecture and urban planning and does a wide range of work, not just in Peru, but in other countries as well. So I would like to start by turning over to Helen, who will tell us about some of her work in South Africa and other places as well. Helen, the floor is yours, and I will jump in when there are about 2 minutes left, probably, to let you know that you are going to have to wrap up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I should be sharing. Is that right? Can you see my screen? Perfect, thank you. Hello, everybody.
Yes,
and
thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share some of the experiences from South Africa. Sorry, I just want to actually move this for 2 seconds. There we go. And our work around land value capture, and in particular, the work that we've done around integrating land value capture strategies into urban planning, and with a strong focus on the provision of affordable housing. So our land value capture program that we've been running started in 2020 as a tripartite partnership between the Development Action Group, which is a Cape Town-based NGO, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and National Treasury City Support Program, who really focuses specifically on cities. The program is really geared towards strengthening the capability of local government officials to be able to institutionalize land value capture, both strategies and tools, into existing policies and programs. In addition, we've also worked quite extensively with built environment practitioners as well as civic organizations and academics in order to be able to sort of mainstream some of the ideas and thinking, and also to be able to drive some of the necessary institutional changes that need to run alongside this. The 4-year program came to a sort of first milestone at the end of 2024, and we are now moving into our second phase of the program. We're really moving from sort of what we talked about was sort of kind of landing the idea of land value capture in South Africa to moving forward towards implementation. And so part of what I'll be sharing with you today is some of our experiences over the last 4 years in how we've been able to institutionalize land value capture into a number of policies and programs, both not just within Cape Town, where I'm based at the moment, but also in a number of other cities across South Africa. So yeah, I love this quote. This is a quote from Medicio Fernandez, which is really that cities are the collective creation and therefore the benefits and costs must be shared equally by all. And this is from the 2010 World Urban Forum. But really, I think this sums up in so many ways kind of what for us kind of drove, sort of drew us to land value capture, and not really just only about the tools, but really about the concept. So we were really drawn to it, not only just about the fact that it was needed to support municipal revenues, to improve service delivery and drive social investment, but we really wanted to see how these revenue streams, in fact, could be key to realizing spatial transformation and the just urban transition. Our work has really focused on growing policy and program support for the role of land value capture in South Africa by driving what we call a spatial transformation agenda. And we've done this specifically through how to essentially access well-located land, look at the creation of affordable housing, and then some creative ways around ways in which we can look at cross-subsidization towards infrastructure investment in historically marginalized neighborhoods, or what we call townships. I'm just going to give you a little bit of and I'm not going to obviously talk to this because this is a map that looks quite crazy, but South Africa in particular is confronted and has been characterized by rampant structural and spatial inequality, which is based both on race and class. And of course, due to the exclusionary nature of South Africa's property and property markets, we've seen the legacy of apartheid essentially being reinforced and entrenched spatially. So these 2 images, in fact, are from Cape Town, which I think really demonstrates probably the most stark spatial inequality globally. And so, of course, this is just a map on the right here of Cape Town. We've also been very concerned that, in fact, a lot of the land policy mechanisms that are currently in place really to support more inclusive and equitable cities have largely been inadequate in being able to respond to this. And so hence the need for really needing to think differently about land policy, in particular land value capture. Also looking at a lot of municipalities who are confronted with serious fiscal constraints. There's also a decline in national grants. So really cities really sort of beginning to struggle around how they're going to begin to finance social investment. And so there's also obviously a risk then that many of the cities begin to see land in many ways as a potential source of revenue for the city fiscus, which can be largely at odds with understanding the social value of land, and how this can be leveraged in terms of land value capture. So we've really looked in South Africa at the kind of plethora of tools that are available, not just to obviously generate revenue in terms of kind of fiscal returns, but also what in fact is possible in terms of the land use regulatory system. So what possibilities may be there to impose some kind of in-kind contribution by private landowners for the public benefit. So I'll start at the bottom here, and really here we've been focusing to quite a large extent and looking at very high value developments. And here looking at the potential for inclusionary housing, we prefer to say more inclusionary zoning on private land. In addition to that, we've also been focusing quite extensively on how to regularize and formalize small-scale affordable rental housing stock through a series of sort of planning and regulatory reforms. And then, of course, at the top, sort of looking more at a fiscal level, really saying what are the options in terms of, what possibility is there for the state to essentially capture some of the value back, what we sometimes talk about value sharing, from the sort of public sector side. And here we've done quite a lot of work on special rating areas, public land leasing. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I'm going to share with you some of our work specifically around the release of public land, and in more particular, the release of municipal land for the delivery of affordable housing. So where is my, sorry, I'm going to get lost here. So I think what's really important is that I think we've recognized that the state really has a significant number of land parcels, in particular municipalities, much of which is either vacant or underutilized. And of course, what's even more frightening is when it's even well located, that we believe could go quite a long way towards addressing our housing crisis if they were released. So in South Africa, the main subsidy scheme that is available for the delivery of well-located, medium-density affordable housing is social housing. It's a subsidy. And to receive this, it needs to be within a restructuring zone. So it has to be within an area where you're wanting to drive spatial transformation. So it can't be on the urban periphery. And as a result of that, that land tends to be of incredibly high value. And so cities have really been at odds around how to resolve this issue around releasing land, oftentimes at sort of essentially below market value in well-located parts of the city. Just coupled with that, we're also seeing a growing number of private developers wanting to step into the affordable housing space. But again, location is a key issue. And if we're talking about affordability, how do we leverage land into these transactions? What we have seen, and this is what our experience, or the experiences at least from 4 cities, have shown us, that releasing land for social and affordable housing projects is incredibly complex. It requires sort of navigating a whole minefield of both sort of legal hurdles and complications, and it requires a great deal of both technical competence as well as organizational coordination on behalf of the state. So what we're seeing is that if they get this wrong, and the risks that they often do is that essentially projects either don't get delivered or they fail to materialize. And so as a result of this, we've seen a real need, or a dire need, to streamline the municipal land release processes whilst also improving transparency in the process. So a lot of our focus here is in supporting the capability and the capacity of municipalities to be able to develop a workable general public land development facilitation processes and standardized best practice processes. And some of these processes involve streamlining the entire process, so kind of standardizing the approval processes so that so it can be fast-tracked. Also an explicit land policy for affordable housing, which essentially outlines the support that municipalities can offer, the discounts available for social affordable housing projects, which also includes discounting land, as well as also being very clear about the conditions that need to be attached to protect public assets into the future. And of course, it provides greater certainty so that, again, these projects don't get delayed. The third one's really interesting, and this actually, it came across, we initially thought it was just in one city, but we saw this across all 4, was really the need to improve what we called land de-risking, which is the upfront project packaging and preparation to really ensure that the projects were feasible. So rather than just simply releasing land to social affordable housing developers, they were actually packaging the land up front before they were doing the disposal. And what we were seeing is that when they did this, there was a much greater chance of the projects actually being what we called shovel ready for developers that essentially are working at very low profit margins, sometimes actually not even at profit because they're running as not profits. But what this was really doing was essentially through the de-risking, they're essentially creating value, which they then, through their processes, then going and discounting, which in itself is legally quite complicated. So we're having to do quite a lot of work around navigating that. The second piece of work has been around inclusionary housing and inclusionary zoning. And here we've really been trying to focus on sort of how we think about how the city identifies very strategic, well-located parts of the city where they might have very high-value properties, particularly buoyant, in a very buoyant market, where they're wanting to try and encourage affordable housing. And so what they'll be doing here is really in these areas establishing what we call an overlay zone, awarding additional development rights over and above the existing land use rights. And then what the city will then do is that in this instance, in order to unlock those development rights, the developer essentially has to meet the condition in terms of the provision of affordable housing units. And these affordable housing units can either, sorry, should I say the costs of these affordable housing units are then essentially covered through the value of these additional development rights and then made available either on site or off site, or in some instances, we were actually testing the legality of whether or not it was possible to do an in lieu payment, which of course is very exciting because it opens up the possibility around essentially transacting on development rights. So we're very excited. I mean, we saw quite a lot of uptake in South Africa. City of Johannesburg has been testing it, and I'll show you some of the success of their work. But the more sort of very kind of traditional land value capture inclusionary zoning was in Stellenbosch, which is just outside of Cape Town. It's probably one of the most high value areas in the Western Cape. And here, where the municipality identified a corridor called the Adam Tass corridor, which was essentially an industrial area, all privately owned. And here they specified that there was a real demand for, well, in Stellenbosch, more generally a demand for affordable housing, but in particular needing to really see how they could begin to support the redevelopment of this very large precinct in a way that it supported greater inclusion. And so at a meeting which we had with the municipality of Stellenbosch, along with one of the mayoral committee members, and Lincoln 18 months ago, the mayoral committee member sort of expresses her almost dismay when we're busy talking around, saying, well, when they do the rezoning from essentially what is an industrial site to mixed use 4, we suddenly went, how much value are we creating? And it suddenly in her mind, she realized that simply with the strike of a pen through this overlay zone, they were going to be creating so much value. And so what was really exciting is that when they put in place the inclusion rezoning policy, they were actually able to, and they did this on a mandatory basis. So all developments within the corridor have a 30% requirement, inclusionary housing, which does not include student accommodation, interestingly enough. And then they worked off a residual land value calculator, which we had helped to develop. And I'm going to read the figures out to you here because in just one of the precincts, they calculated that the additional, it indicated that the value of the additional rights to be granted in one precinct alone was $5 million. So this is quite substantial amount of value that they knew they were creating just simply through an overlay zone. So the other example here is from the city of Johannesburg. Here they've gone for more size-based affordability, but we were really surprised, and we monitored, in fact, from January 2022 to January 2024, the number of applications, and we were really surprised to see that 8,000 inclusionary housing units have been approved by the city, and that this rate of approvals is increasing over time. And interesting enough, on the right here, the green dots indicate the spatial location of where these developments are. And if any of you know City of Johannesburg, you'll know that Sandton is incredibly high end, and a lot of those green dots sit around the sort of high end, top end of residential development. So really starting to see the kind of inclusionary units potentially, entering into parts of the city where we're wanting to see spatial integration. The third area is really around 2 minutes left. I'm going to be super fast. Small scale rental housing. And here we've really been focusing on how do we support regularization and formalization of small scale rental housing in townships. This is an example here. Developers really entering in to start providing much needed affordable rental stock in areas that would traditionally not be the case. Problem is a lot of these developers are really struggling to become fully compliant because of the costs of compliance. And of course, the time related to that. And so we've done quite a lot of work in terms of trying to calculate the necessary incentives, many of which would sit with actually in the land use planning scheme, that could in fact support developers to become fully compliant. And of course, then as an outcome of that, we're seeing a rise in property value and the potential essentially for the collection of property tax. But underpinned with that is the need for a renewed social contract, if one's to think about this. So we've done a lot of work. This work is available also on our website as well. And I suppose just really in closing, I'll go through this because I know I don't have a lot of time, but just to say that we're very aware that, and we were very aware that land value capture is not new in South Africa. We were sort of really begun to see a shift in the way in which everyone's starting to see land value capture, not just as a way to source additional revenue, but really as a way to start driving in a very strategic way a just urban transition. Also seeing a shift in the narrative. So really wanting to move towards implementation, a recognition that this all starts with land. And so we put a lot of emphasis in saying we need a really careful analysis of urban land markets to understand both the opportunities for value capture, but also the destination of the captured value. In terms of the way that we've been working, 3 sort of last final reflections. The one is around being able to provide broad-based technical support and understanding. So we do this sort of across the board. And this, I think, has been really necessary to be able to support municipal officials to recognize the opportunities for value capture. So sometimes officials are coming to us saying, what, were we actually even doing that? Like, and I think that's the start of beginning to lead to a process of embedding RVC into existing development and policy processes. And then, of course, we realize embedding RVC institutionally needs a lot of political support, a lot of transversal alignment across the directorates, both planning, fiscal, and legal, as well as strengthening capabilities. And then lastly, we realize that enabling institutional experimentation and learning is essential for the success. People are learning while doing, they're making mistakes. So how do we create a learning environment that allows for that? Welcome to have a look at both our website, which is landvaluecapture.org.za, where you'll see all of our resources. And we also have sort of as DAG, the Development Action Group, you're also welcome to go and have a look at that. And Robin, thank you.
Great. Thank you for rushing through. But there are lots of great resources that you folks will be able to find out more about sort of the work that's been done. If you could please stop sharing, Helen, so that we can allow Carlos Zeballos, who's going to talk to us about land-based finance strategies to enhance urban resilience and disaster risk reduction. So Carlos, the same thing. I'll let you know when you've got about 2 minutes left. We can see your screen, but we don't see you.
Okay.
Or hear you. Now we can. Great.
Oh, no, sorry.
No
My
problem.
internet is quite complicated today, so I will stop the camera for a
Okay,
while.
great.
But
Okay.
I would just like to, first of all, thank you all for inviting the UIA to this wonderful event where basically we can share some of our ideas. It's really fantastic. Thank you so much. And in this opportunity, I would be glad to share with you some ideas about resilience in disaster risk reduction and how can land-based finance strategies can help on that. So, okay. Well, as you know, climate change is increasing the effects and the intensity and frequency of disasters around the world. Several cases that show the effects and have particularly in the most vulnerable countries and settlements. But not only climate change has some effect, also some other disasters like earthquakes or similar. And one of them, of course, is the mega earthquake that happened in Japan in 2011. That was a 9.3 magnitude earthquake that hit the northern part of Japan. I was actually working in Kyoto at that time, the event that happened every 1,000 years. There are many earthquakes every day in Japan, but none of them that magnitude, because the Pacific Plate is the one that activates in every 1,000 years, no? And I was able to witness live. I was living in Kyoto. We didn't feel much the effect of the earthquake, but we witnessed live the effect of this disaster. And a month after that, we were sent by the government to do some evaluation of in a town, Minami San Rico, where only that town more than 12,000 people perished due to the event. No, and I still recall the sensation was so overwhelming and sad of being there in the middle of this devastation. It reminded me the photos of Hiroshima after the nuclear attack. But I think the important lesson to learn was the Japanese solidarity, how this nation was able to join efforts in several levels and to overcome the effects of this horrendous disaster. No? And just to show you some example, here we see a photo of Yuko Sugimoto in the middle of the debris. She lost everything. But if you see in the upper right corner, you see a light signal, which is the same one here 1 year after that. So that's Japanese resilience. You can see also here in the upper part of the slide, locations that were completely restored after 1 year because of the Japanese resilience and also because of the strategies that took place. And I was able to witness this myself, you know, how Japanese society as a whole integrated to solve this problem. A decade after the disaster, the World Bank presented a report that basically summarized three main lessons from this disaster. First of all, the importance of planning, because it has benefits before and after the occurrence of these events. Second, that it's better if we have a shared responsibility and resilience, because as I mentioned, various stakeholders, public and private, and society itself took upon their shoulders the task of rebuilding the country, as it happened after the World War II, no? And third, that resilience is not a path. It has to be reinvented. It's an iterative process and needs to be adjusted over time. And for that purpose, the use of land-based finance, specifically for disaster risk reduction, is very, very important. And I would like to tell you about some of these strategies that you probably know much better than I, but I would like to mention them anyway. The land value capture that Helen explained brilliantly before. Tax-increment financing that are targeted for a specific area within a city, and then that tax is frozen, and then afterwards, after the improvement of the area, there's also an increase of the increment of the tax. Thirdly, the development charges that are specifically targeted for finance disaster risk reduction initiatives. And of course, public-private partnerships that are very important to address particular problems that can benefit both the community and also involve the interests of the private sector. Now I would like to share 4 studies that are very illustrative of this idea. The first one is in the Netherlands. As you know, the Netherlands is a highly vulnerable country to floods because it's very low, the geography is very low, and the canals that are used for draining the water are basically most of the time upper and in an upper position than the cities. So the Room for the River program aimed to improve the flood safety while enhancing spatial quality. And they do basically LVC strategies involving the readjustment of value capture, giving space to the river, improving safety and also aesthetics, and also public-private partnerships, engaging private developers in order to improve the safety and aesthetics, and for recreational areas that also, of course, they improve the value of the surrounding areas. The outcomes were various and very important. Many millions of Dutch people were found the flood safety improved. There was an enhancement of urban and natural landscape, and also was an interesting demonstration on how to integrate LGF with disaster risk management. The second one is closer to my country, is in Colombia, in Medellin, that has a lot of slums located in formal settlements in high-risk areas that are prone to landslides and floods. So the idea was to relocate residents to other safer areas using this strategy of land readjustment, and also some zoning and developing incentives where private developers can contribute with infrastructure that help disaster risk management in exchange for development rights for other safer areas. And of course, the city gained a lot in the reduction of people that were living in high-risk areas, and improve its facilities and infrastructure, enhancing also public safety. The third one is in Tokyo. That is, of course, a city not only prone to earthquakes, but also to flooding due to typhoons. And they involved LFD strategies such as special assessments to finance flood control projects, and also resilience bonds that were important to finance large-scale infrastructure projects that were repaid when the land increased their value, and this benefits also were important for the private sector. And as a result, the flood defenses that in some cases, like in Tokyo and Osaka, were done in a clever way, involving also approach of the citizens to the waterfront, not only a very how to say detached dam that separates people from their water, but it was done in a brilliant way in which people can involve be closer to the sea. And the last one, New York City, that also prone to hurricanes and rising sea levels, and they did similar to Tokyo, some resilient bonds and some tax increment financing that were created to benefit areas from flood protection. As a result, they created very important resilience infrastructure for several $1 billion, and enhanced the urban resilience, and they will become a model for other coastal cities that face similar risks. So which strategies can be used for integrated to disaster risk management in these urban settings? First of all, some financial instrument like value capture mechanism, such as betterment levies or transfer of development rights that are used to target specific infrastructure, public infrastructure that can be addressed to these particular high-risk areas. No. Secondly, development of charge and impact fees. When, let's say, the government makes infrastructure that will improve substantially and benefit some other surrounding areas, some levy fees can be applied, and also some exemptions to these areas. No. And secondly, it is important to have a legal and regulatory framework based, for example, in urban planning laws that integrate LBF tools within these urban planning regulations, or a clever zoning that will redirect the investments to safer areas and also clearly mark these high-risk areas. Thirdly, when we have this integrated disaster planning into the main urban planning, it is possible to create some disaster resilient strategies, for example, identifying high-risk areas, and also make use of strategic land use planning, so we can avoid developing important areas in zones that are prone to risk. It's very important that officials, planners, policymakers will receive some financial literacy that will be trained in LFP in order to know how to apply them to particular projects of disaster risk management. One of them can be the use of EIS that is becoming more broadly used, and now we have some open source software that can be used for free and benefit several institutions. It's also very important to involve the community, not only because they have their own wisdom and knowledge that probably a technician in an office won't be aware of, but also because if they are aware of this, they will be able to solve these problems easily. I will go fastly because I'm about to finish. Also, it's important to report these expenses and to involve the communities into these strategies so everybody can be represented. It's also very important to avoid potential negative impacts as gentrification. And finally, to include some partnerships that can be strengthen both private and partner initiatives. No? I would like to conclude stressing the importance of cultural heritage. As it is shown in this report of World Bank, cultural heritage is not only tangible but also intangible. It's very important to create disaster resilience, as we learned from the Japanese case in the mega tsunami. And that's precisely the task of our newly created Sustainability Commission at the International Union of Architects. That is aiming to produce two main products. One of them is called the Wisdom of Tradition, is how can we learn from the common knowledge of the communities to address it into modern projects. And the second one is the Urbanization Charter that would definitely include some LBF strategies for cities. And for that purpose, we have been conducting a series of interviews to very important celebrities or personalities that are experts in their fields. And of course, I would be very glad if we can have the chance to interview some of you as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and it's been a pleasure to address these words.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. If you could please stop sharing so that then Geoffrey can sort of take over the slides, that would be great. And I would cede the floor to Geoffrey for his 15 minutes.
Thanks very much. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to contribute to this really interesting event. And I've enjoyed very much the previous presentations. And because I'm sure a lot of what I'm be saying is already been covered, I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I want to focus on housing and the fact that obviously urban development is not keeping pace with increasing urban populations. And this is actually, I was noticing on the radio the other day that the projected population for Nigeria is expected to overtake China by the end of this century. And by 2050, sub-Saharan Africa is expected to get an additional 750 plus million people in urban areas. And that's on top of an existing situation where a large proportion, in some countries, half the urban population is living in non-formal types of housing. So it's an incredible challenge, and one which I don't think the resources that we've got available at the moment are going to be able to cope. So we need every technique we can think of. And for me, a key question is how can planning and land management meet the new urban agenda objectives of providing adequate and affordable housing in urban areas where land prices are high and increasing more rapidly than incomes. And I stress adequate because it's not just the issue of affordability which we need to address. This housing needs to be adequate in many ways, and I'll come on to explain what that means. So the other question I find is that it's important to see how housing can be made available to lower income groups in the long term. And I'll go on to explain what I mean by that also in a second. Because if we have options that actually require expensive subsidies or which distort the market in order to benefit low-income groups, how can we stop that housing which is benefiting the poor being reintegrated back into the market and then not being available in the future? And we need to identify what is available from international experience that we can build on to be applicable in other contexts. And when I'm talking about other contexts, I mean this issue is now not just in urbanizing countries, it's a global challenge. Even in the UK, the government accepts that the housing sector is broken. And when you get to a point where not only low-income groups are finding it difficult to get somewhere adequate to live, but even the middle class are finding it difficult, then you know not only you've got a challenge, but I think you've possibly got more traction for change. At least I'm hoping so. So the current reality is land is a key form of wealth, and this is increasing with demand, especially in countries where market-based economies are dominant. Although urban areas are expanding, powerful vested interests do exist to restrict supply. Winston Churchill made a very big people's budget in 1909, building on what Henry George had been saying, advocating for reform. But that's more than a century ago, and nothing has changed since then. And this is what really, really concerns me. Despite the subprime crisis of 2008, where land and property were the cause of the problem, there's not been enough change in how we actually manage land and housing markets. And public agencies are under pressure in countries all over the world, and land is a major source of corruption and financial distortion. I can say that with confidence because London is widely accepted as the money laundering capital of the world. I've felt for many years in my career being embarrassed being a white British male going around the world, especially in countries of the British Empire. But I don't need to apologize now because it is a global problem and the UK is suffering as much as anyone else. Governments do, however, and this is the really important point, governments do have the necessary powers to improve the equity and efficiency of land markets if they wish. And that, for me, is the key point. Obviously, technical resources are enough, but the New Urban Agenda was adopted at the UN in 2016, and Article 31, I'll just summarize quickly, commits itself to promoting national, subnational, and local housing policies that support progressive realization of the right to adequate housing for all. And this, I think, is the key that we need to focus on. A menu of progressive options is available. I was commissioned by UN Habitat in 2018 to prepare a report on land-based finance. And I invited a young graduate from Mexico to help me. And what we found was very, very interesting. We got a large amount of literature and broke that down into three basic forms: tax-based instruments, fee-based instruments, and development-based instruments. And we realized very quickly that tax-based instruments are very, very difficult to relate back into the housing sector. They tend to be accumulated into the broader revenue stream of governments. So we looked at effectively fee-based and development-based instruments. Now, and many of these have been discussed today, so I will go on through them rather quickly. Happy if anyone wants in discussion if there's time to expand. But they need to ensure that land management it distributes the cost and the benefits as equitably as possible. And I like the discussion we've had earlier in the session about land value sharing, which implies a more congenial way of doing things than land value capture, which implies contention and dispute and a more assertive attitude. I think both are probably needed, but I like to think of sharing as a preferable way of starting. Now, since the granting of planning or development approval by the state increases land values, to me, it seems obvious that the state is entitled to benefit from the increment or allocation of that increase in the public interest. Land management can therefore be an effective means of improving access to adequate and affordable housing on a self-financing and a long-term basis. So what do we mean by affordable housing? Well, it's defined differently in different contexts. One has to acknowledge that. In the USA, it's considered if the total cost, including user bills, is less than 30% of net household incomes. However, in the UK, housing is defined as affordable if it is 80% of the market rate. Now, if the market rate is 10 times more than is affordable according to the UN, then 80% of that is clearly ridiculously unaffordable. So how you define the issue, I think, is really very important. The UN definition does say that it looks at it in terms of the price to income ratio, within which 3 to 1, in other words, 3 times annual household income. Housing should not be more than 3 times annual household incomes if it's to be affordable. 4.1 is unaffordable, and 5.1 is seriously unaffordable. And for tenants, a rent to income ratio is considered affordable if it's less than 30% of net household income. So that's the basis on which we're discussing all of these concerns. It's also important to remember, I think, that household structure influences affordability. A household of 2 adults and 1 child will have much more affordability on a given income than a household with 4 or 5 children, where their costs of living are much more much greater. So the definition of adequate housing involves a whole number of issues: security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability to make sure to meet local needs against the cold and so on, accessibility to other needs such as employment, location, and cultural adequacy. It's got to reflect the way people live. So this wide range of issues that adequate housing involves. So when I was commissioned by UN Habitat to look at land-based finance for affordable housing, I offered to expand the terms of reference to include this wider range of considerations, because I think it's absolutely vital. And so when we looked at the various instruments, we looked at the various definitions of what they involved, and these have been discussed earlier, so I won't go into great detail on them. Tax-based instruments, I've already said we're not going to focus on too much. Fee-based instruments, payments received in exchange for permission to develop. Rights can be sold or at auction or at a fixed price by developers, and rights may be transferable to other locations or resold. That's transfer development rights, which we've heard. I think it's really important to say that each of these options and policy instruments has strengths and limitations. There is no universally applicable policy instrument that I see as being applicable in every case. They need to be context sensitive. So I think it is important that when we were doing our report, we listed the characteristics, the pros and cons of each option as we saw them, and then we listed examples where they had been undertaken, so that people could then find out more about which option might be appropriate in a given context. So land sales or leases, they've been applied widely in China, Ethiopia, Mongolia, Tanzania. We list all the strengths and limitations of those. We went on to look at land pooling and land readjustment, which has also been discussed quite extensively today. I did find it very interesting when I was working with the World Bank some time ago that a colleague, Chandan Doishkar, wrote a very interesting paper to show that the first land readjustment policy, land pooling policy, was not new. It was in 1791 by George Washington to acquire land for the US state capitol. So I did enjoy telling friends in the World Bank that when they went to work, they were sitting on the world's first ever land readjustment policy. It was applied successfully in many countries. We've heard India, Albania, and Ethiopia has also been applied. I was involved with the World Bank on what would have been by far the largest ever land pooling project in developing the state capital of Andhra Pradesh in India. Sadly, for a whole number of reasons, that didn't happen. But it is a policy which I think is incredibly valid. When I was working in Albania, I did suggest one way of looking at the expanding areas of the capital, where taking a given area of land, one could enable it to be developed much more efficiently in ways which all the existing landowners would benefit from. You could have additional land for sale or for allocation on social use, and you could also allocate land for community centers, parks, and educational facilities and markets. So, you know, it is a very, very appropriate instrument, it seems, in most cases, for peri-urban areas where the increment in land value is likely to be highest.
Geoffrey, you've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm nearly there. Request for proposals, I've mentioned land banking. But what I think is really important, and this is the point I want to drive home, is that any policy instrument which involves direct or indirect subsidies in order to benefit the poor is not going to work. And what we did identify is a range of community-led instruments which take land out of the market. Community land trusts are the most effective and widely applied. They've only recently expanded into urbanizing countries, but they are very, very valuable. And of course, housing cooperatives and various forms of communal land ownership. These, I think, are incredibly applicable, especially in countries where customary land ownership is traditional. This is the report that we did for UN Habitat. Criteria for success. We've heard already about regulatory frameworks. Policymakers need to have the understanding of land markets in order to maximize the benefit. Spatial land use planning needs to promote compact polycentric urban forms, and different land tenure regimes need to be considered. I did have an example from Ankara. I'll show it very, very quickly. They had a very pragmatic way. People squatted on public land, and the state simply subdivided the land into what would have been blocks. The poor then were transferred by the developers, but the poor sold their land to the developers who built the housing, which expanded across the city. Eventually, the market, of course, took over, but it was a system which I find very impressive. I've summarized that in all my other experience in a recent book I've done. And I'd like to thank you very much for your patience and attention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to Geoffrey for finishing right on time, and to the other participants as well, sort of for sharing sort of very interesting ideas in terms of trying to, I think you can stop sharing your screen, Geoffrey, maybe?
Oh, sorry,
So that
sorry.
then, no problem. Well, okay, great, thank you. So in terms of some general ideas that come out, I mean, one sort of that came out throughout sort of all of them, I think, is that there are challenges around the world, right? That thinking about land-based finance or adequate housing isn't just an issue of the global south, but really sort of hits all income levels across all different kinds of countries. One additional thing that I might add there is sort of that I think that the role of insurance as both a cost and as an instrument that we need to think about, sort of we'll need to consider more and more, especially sort of as we see the kinds of disasters that are linked to climate and sort of extreme weather that's connected to climate. From sort of another point was thinking about the importance of landing the idea of land value capture and things alone is really hard and politically sensitive and complicated, as well as thinking about the portfolio of instruments and how they're actually implemented. Another point is the importance of integrated planning and appropriate legal and regulatory environments. And here, one of the challenges is exactly what we mean by integrated, because when we're talking to disaster risk folks, it's about integration with that. When we're talking to finance ministers or finance or budget offices in cities, it's about linking to sort of financial plans in the budget. When you talk to service providers, it's about ensuring that services are connected to that adequate housing and are ready to sort of are resilient across all kinds of potential things. It's often even just transport and land use alone is really, really hard to integrate together to ensure that folks are living in places and have services to connect them to livelihood possibilities, as well as just broader climate change plans and other public sector, public space plans. Right? So there's a broad challenge of integration that is very, very important. And then probably last but not least was really this emphasis on the need for shared responsibilities and benefits, and the idea that on the importance of community-led processes, consideration of equity and social justice, public participation, as well as the role of tradition in defining what is possible, and traditional practices that have helped communities survive for hundreds and hundreds of years that sometimes get pushed aside sort of when sort of the planners step in, right? And so in ensuring that those things can all be brought together. So those were just some of the ideas that I pulled out. So of these presentations, what I'd like to do now is present a couple of questions, or just start with one question sort of to everyone in terms of some of the good practices, some that were shared here, but also beyond for incorporating land-based finance into urban management frameworks. And I'd say when we think about good practices, that I think it's also useful to share really bad practices of things that we see and that we've seen not work. Because while I think some of the things that do work get shared more readily, things that don't work don't get shared, but we can learn perhaps even more from those and thinking about how we can sort of change those. And so that would be, I would turn first to Helen, and then we'll allow Carlos and Geoffrey, and then the next question. So we'll do the reverse order. So Helen.
Great, thank you, Robin. And firstly, just both a very special thank you to both Carlos and Geoffrey for their really great inputs. So thank you. I think, you know, when we think about how we institutionalize land value capture with the cities that we work with, a lot of it really, I think, comes down to how we think about the way in which we do this. So, you know, a lot of the times there's a real sort of preoccupation with sort of talking about tools and instruments, and actually a lot of it is about the sort of the way in which we need to be thinking about how we're working with cities. And a lot of the work that we've done, I'd say over the last 6 years, a lot of it quite iterative, quite relational, a lot of it kind of really working to sort of how we manage and navigate power, talks to sort of how we begin to land some of these conversations, because, you know, it's very easy to land a conversation around sort of how you're going to generate revenue. And, you know, you start talking about millions of dollars, you know, you're going to, you know, you attract, you know, you'll attract the attention of the chief financial officer. But when you start talking about land value capture to drive spatial transformation or an urban transition, you're perhaps moving into a slightly uncharted territory. And so a lot of what we've learned from our own practice is, how do you begin to, on the one hand, convene spaces that allow for sort of critical thought leaders, not just within municipalities who might be the champions of some of this thinking, but, you know, unlikely academics who may in fact not always even agree with you, and enter into a place of really constructive dialogue or debate. And so that's been a really important place for us to at least center some of the conversations, because within that arise some of what we call the sort of unlikely champions. One of them, I mean, and I'll record this because this is an interesting story about how we drive change. So we started engaging with one of the lead planners from one of the cities all the way back in 2012. And I remember her almost wanting to sort of say, what on earth are you doing talking to us about this? Please, you know, almost leave my office, like so cynical, entering into a dialogue with us in 2018. I kid you not, in 2022, she published the first, she got it actually approved in council, an inclusionary policy framework for the province. Like, and very, very, very sophisticated. So she did what we would call like a classic 180 pivot. Now that's really radical, because, you know, you're working with sort of, so how do you find the unlikely champions and what do those processes look like? And I think what we've also learned is that it's an accompaniment process where you're working from behind. So we don't come in and operate as consultants trying to drive more tools. It's really about how you work within existing processes, existing practices, identify opportunities, and then begin to say, actually, where are the gaps, where are the cracks that we can begin to influence and look at innovation.
Great. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you very much. I was thinking on bad practices, perhaps in disaster risk reduction that I was talking about. One could be lack of good planning that does not consider high-risk areas, or is not properly assessed, or there is a lack of planning or mapping in these high-risk areas. And most importantly, is the lack of involvement of dwellers, residents in the areas. Many times this is a top-bottom process where the technicians, technocratics have a very narrow-minded view, and then it doesn't involve all the variables that need to be considered. And as experience, we had that problem once, but it was very interesting to involve the population and learn from them, not which are the most important prone areas to disaster according to their experience. And some of them were not even mapped in the official municipality planning zoning, no? And also it is important for them to be part of this process, and then if there's something like a relocation, it would be better accepted if they have been part of the process rather than it's just an order from the municipality or whatever institution. So this should be some of the ideas that come to me now.
Great, thank you. Geoffrey. You are muted, so we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, great.
Yeah, my real concern is that I'm very aware that a lot of the ideas, if not all of them, that we've been talking about and which are widely published in the academic literature and taught to everybody who's working in this field, these have been around for a long time. There are good examples of innovation which we tend to keep citing. And the reason we keep citing is because they're not being expanded or diversified nearly enough. And I think the reason for that, let's be honest, is political. The developers, the landowners, the investors are playing the system to their advantage. And I speak very, very clearly and openly about the UK situation. It may be different well, it is different everywhere, of course, but I think the fact that it's happening in a country which prides itself on having a town planning and urban tradition of managing things well, if it happens in a country that with that self-esteem, if you like, or reputation, self-justified reputation, if it's happening here, then I'm sure it happens elsewhere. What is happening is that developers and landowners are investing in politics. They are buying politicians. They are influencing development. They are obtaining land and insisting that if it's acquired by the state, it's reflected on the hope value, not the existing use value. So they're gaming the system throughout. And the global elite are now investing in London massively. You know, nothing has really changed since 2008, when the whole global financial crisis was caused by the mismanagement of the housing sector in one country, the USA. The global elite are now still treating housing as an investment opportunity and a commodity. There are developments in my part of West London which are being marketed in the Far East and the Middle East. And local people cannot afford access to housing which is defined officially as affordable, because it isn't affordable. And so we're looking at a situation where, despite the widespread knowledge of these really innovative, genuinely progressive ideas, those with a vested interest in the status quo in countries around the world need to be persuaded, pressured, or ultimately forced to accept change. Because if we can't achieve that, then we could be meeting with this seminar in another year, another 5 years, another decade, and still discussing the problems and the need for change. And at my age, I don't want to be waiting another 10 years, because I may not have another 10 years, who knows? But I do feel really, really concerned, sometimes angry. And I'm using this frustration and anger as fuel for action. And I'm getting more involved in the UK now, having worked globally for more than 5 decades. And we're starting campaigns to try and, you know, on a technical level, if we can find legal ways in which the system is not working, that has to be changed, we'll do that. if we can raise public awareness and consciousness and support in order to get change, we'll do that. So it's a multi-pronged approach I think we need in order to find ways of expanding these ideas so that they become the norm, not just the exception. The end of my rant.
No, well, sadly, I concur with most of it, and sort of also I'm on the sort of who knows how long we're all going to be, if any of us are going to be around, right? And so this need for urgency. So in terms of, I mean, you have worked in many places around the world. Are there systems that you've seen that you think have changed in a positive way that we could somehow, like, I don't like to use the word market, but effectively it's what we have to do to persuade folks that the outcome has been good, to sort of encourage others to try that same kind of thing? Have there been examples that you've found officials or developers even and regular citizens find persuasive? And then
I
I'll
think
ask
a
that
lot
question.
of it does depend on how we present the argument. If we can present the argument in a way which you can feel everyone is a winner and no one's going to have to pay the price or suffer, then that's more likely to gain traction. Also, I think positive reinforcement is much better than criticism. I won't say which country, but I was talking in one country with a senior official, and I was trying to persuade them to adopt a land pooling approach in a peri-urban area. And in that country, the state owned the land. And if a farmer, if the state wanted the land on a peri-urban area from the farmer, they would simply give the farmer another piece of land somewhere else. And I said to the official, could we play a game? And he looked curious. And I said, look, just pretend I'm the government and you're a farmer and I want your land. And he said, well, I have to move. I said, okay, so you have to move. But what happens if your parents, your grandparents, and all your ancestors were buried in the area where you're living? And I could see the guy's brain changing gear because he'd never thought about it in personal terms. So then I said, well, look, as a consultant, if I can find a way of enabling you to stay in your area and the government get the land for development, would you be interested? And of course, you had to say yes. So, that was one sort of eye-opening moment for me. I was sort of, it just happened coincidentally. I just happened to think of it. But I think the lesson for me is if we can present arguments in ways which will relate to the concerns of those we're trying to persuade, it's more likely to be successful. Sorry, Anne.
No, that's great. Carlos, have you sort of found examples that have been sort of more persuasive than others, or ways of speaking that have allowed sort of more of a discussion and then real reform in your work?
I shared some of them. I shared the case of the Netherlands, for example. I think it was I have not been involved directly there, but I know for sure it has been a very successful example, not only in providing people a safer environment, but also in improving the value of their properties. There are some families, for example, that they were forced to be relocated because their houses were to be flooded. But the government took care of them, and they are very happy with the place they are living, and they're also not so far away. I was very touched with the idea of Geoffrey involving the ancestral of the people, because sometimes when you talk about relocating, and that could be a bad example here in my country, people living in the Coca Canyon, which is a wonderful landscape UNESCO geopark, but prone to earthquakes because the people living there very close to a volcano that is in eruption now. So the government decided to give them lands 150 kilometers away in a deserted area, And some people came and then came back because the attachment to this landscape forms a cultural bond that comes from centuries, from times of the pre-Hispanic settlers. So involving these considerations is very, very important for the success. How the people feel, not in terms only the economic point of view, but also from other issues regarding cultural and societal issues.
Helen?
I mean, I want to talk from our experience of working with developers, particularly top end, like right in the inner city. And so a lot of the developers actually were very open to the idea of land value capture and in particular inclusionary housing. So, I mean, one of the developers who we met with, he was, he said, listen, like, as long as we've got certainty and we know what the rules of the game are, we will simply factor this into the cost of land. So this is where the landowners get upset. And of course, where if the politicians are connected to the landowners, then suddenly you get pushback, right? So we were having to be very careful also around how we were explaining, I mean, Geoffrey, I share exactly. I mean, the kind of translating cities into real estate assets and the potential for inclusionary zoning to become a tool to essentially curb speculation and drive down the price of land is very, very, very powerful. But, you might not necessarily win that argument politically. And so the city of Johannesburg, Manentle was describing recently, we were sharing with chief financial officers, we were talking about this, saying, how did you win this, right? How did you get the city to approve this? And she said, we got this through not on the technicalities, but on the outcomes that we wanted to achieve. So that was also kind of an interesting spin on it. So, I think the developers were on board. What was also really frightening, actually, when we were doing this work was the developers were saying, we use residual land value. So we were saying to the city, when you do your calculations for your financial feasibility on the policy, use this because this is what the developers are using. And they were saying, no, but, unfortunately, we don't want to chip into developer profits. I mean, it's got nothing to do with profits. We're not trying to chip into the developers' profits. So I think it's kind of like, and so the whole model that they used to calculate this was fundamentally flawed. And so they actually scrapped the feasibility. So the policy has never come out because of that.
This brings up, thank you. Thank you, Helen, and to all of you for your comments. In the chat, There's been a little bit of discussion about sort of what happened in Medellin and the confusion of aligning developer and landowner interests and sort of how they really are quite different and need to be disaggregated. I know that Martin is just waiting to jump in and say something.
Thank you, Robin. I think this is one of the major mistakes that planners do in equating both, and they're not the same animals. They should be educated as different animals. And advanced developers do understand that whatever they don't pay for increasing building rights, they would pay for the landowners. Advanced developers understand that. And then, so for them, they rather pay this to the city to convert these revenues into new demand for housing, particularly social housing where they don't have, and for infrastructure where they don't have also. So, and there are cases and cases, and I was once in Recife discussing with about the introduction of additional building rights, charges on additional building rights, and we brought in some developers from São Paulo for the discussion there, and we had basically almost a personal, physical fight between the local developers that are basically, they call themselves terreneiros, or lenders, with the developer from São Paulo, not with us that were promoting the instrument even. They were the developer from São Paulo that is open-minded was a bigger menace to them than the landowners. Anyway, so I think this is a major issue that has to be put on the table, and planners are to be blamed many times that they bring both and they treat both as the same animal. They are not.
I think the importance of disaggregating different groups and ensuring that sort of they're represented and can have those discussions or can be part of the discussion is very important. I mean, it does not erase the problem or the challenge, right? I mean, you're going to have to deal with landowners. I mean, in loads of vested interests all over the place that often, as Geoffrey is saying, have been buying not just land, but politicians, right? And in influence and sort of shaping rules. So ensuring that somehow we can find regulatory processes or legal structures that create some of these holes so that the opportunities sort of for folks in communities can actually use those rules sort of to move towards something that is more sustainable financially, socially, politically, sort of over time is something that is sort of a big challenge. I think that we could talk and we could bring a lot of other people in who I think who have great experience and ideas here. Unfortunately, our time is running out, so I'd like to turn now to the closing remarks and give everyone sort of on the panel sort of 3 minutes to talk about their ideas about sort of what some of their key takeaways were and some next steps of how we can actually move forward as a community and sort of try to create the incentives so that other places can disseminate and actually implement some of these good examples in different places. So let me, what we'll do is we'll start with Geoffrey, then turn to Carlos and end with Helen. Geoffrey?
Thanks very much. I was very impressed by a book by Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State, because that demonstrates that in many cases, the state is in a very good position and has been effective in regulating markets. And I think this is what it comes down to, basically. How do we regulate markets? And how do we do that in the public interest? What we've seen over recent years is an erosion of the social contract in so many cases, where individual aspiration is regarded as the primary objective of economic policy. And I would like to see a much more widespread application of non-market options on housing and land development, a much greater diversity of tenure options. The city in the world which is regarded as the most livable is Vienna. And half of the housing and land in Vienna is in some form of social ownership. And land is not primarily an investment channel. They invest in other things. And I'd like to see that as the way forward in terms of social policy, economic policy, and particularly its application in the land and housing sector. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Carlos?
I would be, well, first of all, thank you to Geoffrey and Helen for the wonderful insights. That were very, I learned a lot from you. It was very interesting. I would like to perhaps think about the people in developing countries who are in percentage the larger occupation, and most of them occupy in high risk prone areas. And there are several conflicts related to land traffickers or some political interests that need to be addressed in an urgent way. So perhaps climate change is of course a problem, but also an opportunity. When somebody suffers a disaster, all these windows of opportunity can come for change. I think it's better to plan for that. And I think one of the lessons that we have learned today from Helen, for example, and social housing can be somehow directed to these high risk prone areas, in particularly in developing countries. So for people who settled there because they didn't have any other option. No, they moved from the rural areas to these large cities. So I think that should be something that we should reflect upon, because most of humanity is now living in this prone areas, and we should do something about it.
Great. Depressing, but sort of insightful. Helen.
So I suppose my takeaway and maybe I suppose my kind of concluding comments is that we in this conversation that we're having about land value capture is we really need to be able to almost bring it back to the basics and move back to the concept, like the concept of land value capture, and to really kind of almost sort of caution against the sort of overriding of like, let's focus on more tools and more tools. But I think we need to get down to the basics. And I think this is really important in the conversations that we have with cities and the way in which we're writing about this and the way we're talking about it. So I think that's for me, it's like, it's a conception, it's a mind shift that needs to happen, that it becomes much more conceptual. At the same time, we also need to be really being able to sort of land this with cities who really are at the forefront of being able to innovate. And we need, and I, often hear sort of cities right across Africa saying, oh, not doing land value capture, but actually saying you are in the prime, you've actually got the most opportunity to be thinking about this and to adapting a series of policies and instruments. So I think it's about how do we sort of rethink those opportunities. And that means, I think, sort of going back in the way that we approach this. I do think that the time is now. I think that we've definitely got a much clearer sense that the conversations we were having 15 years ago are very different to the kinds of conversations we're having now. And there's almost a readiness, a receptiveness from a lot of cities who perhaps are very fiscally constrained, but are wanting to think about how to do things differently. And so I think, again, how do we step into that space? And I suppose I just want to encourage everyone to sort of caution around the sort of tool fanaticism. The other thing is, I think, how do we sort of going forward, how do we create spaces for exchange and for learning? We keep hearing, in the way in which we're engaging with cities and with others, keep saying like we're wanting to learn from each other. So this idea that the sort of work gets landed from somewhere else, like, and when we initially started the work with, we're going to bring in lots of international technical experts, but actually the experts sit within the cities themselves. So how do we nurture that through an accompaniment that says, actually how do we support learning? I think is going to be absolutely critical. So, cities to cities, across the continent, across the globe. And I think, again, sort of bring this conversation right down to kind of who are the drivers. So, yeah, that's it. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to follow up, Helen, just one really quick thing is in terms of sort of what you found to be most effective in South Africa. Is it that folks learning from other cities in South Africa itself or in the region?
Cities wanting to learn from each other, and so that you don't try and see the sort of like, let's re-innovate, but they're actually learning together while doing, because there is a lot of trial and error in a lot of this work. And I think, you don't want to be doing, so the idea is they're not trying to copy tools. That's what we're not seeing, which I think is a really positive thing, but they're wanting to think through the real complexities of these things. So I think, and that's been really positive. So it changes the kind of role that we play in terms of, we'll bring in technical expertise and technical advisors, both local and international, but sometimes actually just about holding and creating that space for exchange. Oh. You're on mute.
Yes, sorry, my hands. I think that's a great place to close on, as this today, sort of all of today, this session, as well as the other sessions today, are an opportunity for us to share and learn, so we can hear about what works, what hasn't, get to meet other people, hopefully establish contacts that we can continue sort of to learn from, and work together in this process of accompaniment, which I think is a great way to think about it. Sort of that sort of we're working with and from behind some of these communities and leaders that we want to support moving in the right direction. And sometimes that's very hard, but it's really wonderful to know that there are so many great people that are out there working in this space, innovating in different kinds of ways in all corners of the world. So again, I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Martine for jumping in and adding sort of some richness to the discussion, as well as the folks that participated in the chat. And I'll turn it back to Cynthia, sort of to move to the next panel. But thank you all.
Thank you, Robin. And as we conclude this insightful panel discussion, I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to our distinguished panelists and to the moderator, Robin. Excellent job. And your presentations and comments can inspire us to think more critically about how we can leverage and effectively implement these powerful tools. And we learn about practices, but also about the political barriers for change. And so, thank you for all. And in 1 minute, we are going to start our next panel, the roundtable. Let me do the welcome to we continue with the next panel and welcome all the panelists, but my job is to welcome Claudio Ascioli to our new panel discussion. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to him. Claudio is an architect and urban planner, a developer practitioner with nearly 40 years. He's very young, but he has 40 years of experience in more than 30 countries, working as a practicing expert, program manager, resident technical and political advisor, or short-term consultant to governments, bilateral and multilateral organizations, academic institutions, civil society organizations, and community-based organizations. Claudio has done all. And I give the floor to him, and he is going to present the group of experts that will join us in this panel and to share their experiences and insights. So welcome, Claudio.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for inviting us to join the Urban Thinkers Campus, focusing on such an important fundamental issue such as land-based finance. Without much, let's say, losing time, given that we really running around the clock and we have some very interesting panelists, so let me quickly introduce each one of them. So we have with us Bautista Pino. He is an economist, graduated from the University of Buenos Aires. He has done quite a lot of work on social urbanism, and he has been associated with the municipality of 3 Fevereiro in the province of Buenos Aires. David Amborski, he's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University School of Urban and Regional Planning and the founding director of the Center for Urban Research and Land Development. He has been doing quite a lot of research, advising the National Executive Forum on Public Property. He has done things in the city of Toronto, being part of the housing task force in the province, promoting affordable housing, and so on. We have Martin Smolka, who has been for a quarter of a century the director of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy Program for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's an economist. He has been widely quoted and has, I was actually a witness how popular his land value capture global lecture had become in UN Habitat. And he has done quite a lot of work in Latin America. And then we have Andres Blanco, who is with the Inter-American Development Bank. He is a senior urban development and housing specialist. He has done quite a lot of work on housing and land use planning. He was a professor of urban planning and regional planning at the University of Florida, and he's really has been doing a lot of work in Latin America. Now, we have had the chance in the previous sessions to actually nail down what land-based finance is. And in this particular session, we're going to look at what are the models that we have, the cases that showcase the various forms that we can make use of land to finance urban development. So one fundamental question is, why do we do that? Why do we use land to mobilize resources? For which purpose? So we've seen in our history of urban development that the property tax, the land and property tax, is a usual instrument where you can, let's say, transfer resources from rich areas to poor areas. So actually promoting investments in infrastructure. So we have the value capture instruments that get, depending where you are, different modalities. Now, how do we raise this to the program level? We have the community land trust, widely used in Kenya and in the US, where community groups mobilize resources through a common property of land, the sale of development rights, or air rights, which is quite popular within the instrument of the Statute of the City, and Brazilian cities are mobilizing billions of dollars of that and creating a kind of Robin Hood type of instrument to transfer resources to poorer areas. Different forms of land banking, land sharing, land readjustment, widely used in Japan, Korea. I had the opportunity to be in Korea, and quite interesting mechanism that they use to mobilize private funding through land readjustment, and different forms of, let's say, betterment improvement taxes. So having said that, let me just put some rules, house rules for the presentation. So we have quite a number of speakers. And remember, this is the idea to have a round table, which means our presentations will have to be really focused and keep it to a maximum of 15 minutes. I know that some of you have made a presentation, so I would really ask you to keep it short, go to the core issues of the presentation. Let's keep the 15 minutes. When you're reaching a little bit of, let's say, 14 minutes, I will give you a warning so that you can conclude and we can pass on to the next speakers. And then once everyone speaks, I will come back to do a wrap up on the key issues that you have brought forward and put up some questions for you to further address the issues that maybe you did not manage to go in depth in the way you wanted in your presentation. So with that, I give now the floor to Martin Smolka. Please, Martin.
So the last one.
Oh, are we? No, okay. Let's start then. Let's follow the order that is there on the presentation. So let me give the floor to Bautista Pino. Please, you have the floor.
Hello, good evening. How are you? We're going to try to be shorter than 15 minutes.
That's great.
I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Oh. You're seeing the presentation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, through this presentation, I will share with you some of our learnings in the implementation of the first case in the Buenos Aires province, and perhaps in the country, of land-based financing models centered in the public participation in the land value valorization process through changes in urban indicators. This model is focused on the taxation of capital gains raised from the increase in land values due to the increases in the constructive levels to reach densification objectives along the urban ejido of our territory. First, we're going to present Tres de Febrero in the Buenos Aires province, Argentina. Tres de Febrero is a city located in the province of Buenos Aires, which is the biggest province of Argentina. The whole province houses around 18 million inhabitants, and Tres de Febrero has approximately 370,000 people according to the last national census results. Tres de Febrero is next to the capital city of the country, Buenos Aires City, and it is one of the largest jurisdictions of the Great Buenos Aires area, metropolitan area, where almost the 35% of the total population of Argentina lives. It integrates the first ring of the conurbano of Buenos Aires City. Its most important district is called Caseros, that has about 1/3 of the city's population. Tres de Febrero is surrounded by other 5 cities called San Miguel, San Martín, Morón, La Matanza, Hurlingham, which are also very important districts and cities of the west region of the conurbano area. Moreover, the territorial structure of the city is characterized by strong urban barriers that fragment the urban territory and segregates the land in the city. These barriers are railway lines, highways, and broad avenues. The economic structure and the urban activities that are supported by each district of the city are also signed by these segregation lines. Moreover, the development level of each centrality is also defined by the closeness to railway stations and to the connectivity opportunities to attain the capital city of the country. Tres de Febrero has polycentrality as a major characteristic of its territory. Each antique train station became in a centrality that concentrates gastronomy, services, food, and urban life. Commercial areas are the heart and identity of each neighborhood, and where the community extends, where life extends and socialization also occurs. Residential areas are concentrated around commercial areas. Reaching higher level of mix of uses is a great challenge for us and one of our major objectives as urban planners and policymakers. Then, here we will share the roadmap that we implemented in this case. The city has developed a strong urban planning process. The first step, a deep urban planning process also. The first step was standing a deep strategic urban plan that defined the most important issues that the city has to attend in order to grow and to develop. We defined the actual urban diagnosis, and we discussed with the whole community the desired territorial model that stands the city in which we would like to live in 50 years. Then we transform this desire, these wishes, in land regulations that work on land uses and urban indicators that define future constructive permissions in order to achieve the morphology wanted. One second. The Zoom has some trouble. Then we transform this desire in land regulations that work on land uses and urban indicators that define future constructive permissions in order to achieve the morphology wanted. These regulations are supported in the Urban Planning Code. The code defines not only uses and activities, but also the densification objectives for each district. We defined urban priorities and we focused on the development of underdeveloped areas, such as the rehabilitation and social integration of slums and degraded zones. We also created an economic instrument called the Urban Development and Sustainable Habitat Fund that raises money from the public participation in capital gains that come from increases in land value. The city also kept forward with other regulations, such as affordable housing instruments, the creation of a public land bank that administrates all the land state tenancies, and a strong domain regularization program in a particular office that attends specially segregated and poor areas to solve domain and private scriptures vacancies to help families to become the real owners of their homes. We had to design a new model to implement the public participation in capital gains that came from the increases in land values because of the state's action through urban indicators. We designed a method to capture gains from the greater constructive use that is materialized when we extend a construction permission to a real estate project. The rate and the aliquot of the public participation in capital gain varies according to 2 different criteria. The first determinant corresponds to the location of the real estate initiative. The territory has promoted areas to encourage more construction projects by reducing fiscal pressure on the total investment. In those areas, the tax rate is lower and it goes from 1% up to 35%. The other determinant is the total amount of square meters of greater constructive use. Greater constructive use and pressure on the new urban indicators will extend a higher tax rate that expresses the public participation in the new capital gain. Moreover, the whole gains and resources created through increases in land value are determined in their expenditure by the law and the regulations. Capital gains can only be invested by the government in public infrastructure, in public works, and in social and urban integration processes of slums and informal settlements. The economic model we designed has several characteristics that allowed us to objectify and to standardize the method to each parcel of the cadastre. The first issue is the regulation of a new municipal law that created a tax called Right for Urban Development and Sustainable Habitat. We individualized for each square of the cadastre the land incidence value through a statistical method called residual deductive method. It separates the components of the total benefits equation for the real estate industry and values the incidence of land in an investment project. The result of this method is illustrated in an open plane that allows to visualize the incidence value. It can be seen, it can be visited because it is published in the government website. Moreover, we created also a plane illustrating the tax rate in each area of the urban ejido. It reflects the aliquot defined to calculate the total public participation in the land valorization that arises from the modification of the urban indicators. This plane and these zones are defined according to the development level reached by each district, using the fiscal instrument as an incentive to pull in new real estate initiatives in most vulnerable and exposed areas. Finally, the tax is charged and paid when the government extends a construction permission to an urban developer. This instrument and this model was developed during 2019 and 2020 with the pandemics also. It has nearly 4 years and a half since it was turned on. The total gain captured in this period ascends about $7 million, which is a very considerable amount of money for the local public budget and allowed the city to double capital expending and public investing every year. So then we can say that it is a very important instrument for the urban development of 3 de Febrero City. Here you can find a short example of the expenditure and the capital investment of resources gained by land valorization. These pictures have been taken from Google Maps. You can visit it over there. It corresponds to Capitán Bermúdez, a case in which we turned on a process of social and urban integration. It is a poor neighborhood, and it contains a slum and a settlement of buildings built by National Social Housing Program, and the results are very advanced. Here you have the case before and the case after the land-based financing model, because we used capital gains and the public participation in capital gains to invest in public works in this case also. The last case, and to end this exposition, this last example corresponds to another program in which the government invests the new fiscal resources. It refers to a tactical urbanism plan that tends to rehabilitate and regenerate the public space through small interventions in public works, which transforms not only the space, but also changes the uses and the activities that happens in that public space so as to promote new ways and new forms of urban life. So, this is some of the learnings we gained in this process, and thank you very much for the space to share these learnings and to show our model, our economic model of public participation in land valorization and capital gains, which are then invested in urban and social integration processes of poor areas in order to equalize the development levels in the whole territory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bautista. Very interesting where you share with us the importance of creating a legislation with the code and making use of densification strategies to create what you call the capital gains, which has some very interesting similarities with other tools we're going to see. And yeah, the $7 million generated in 4 years within the context of Argentina indeed is a performance that worthwhile to highlight. Let me then now pass the floor to David. David, you have the floor. And I would recommend you, because you have a big presentation, to jump a little bit on the introduction, since we covered that quite a lot in the sessions.
I will then. Okay, thank you. Hopefully I can share my screen without problem. Let's see. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay.
If you can put on presentation mode, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that slideshow. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. There we go.
Fantastic.
Anyhow, I wanted to focus on public land assets and how you can use value capture on public land assets rather than privately owned ones, because I think there's a lot of potential in that. That's something that's been looked at by a number of people. There's a great book called The Public Wealth of Cities, How to Unlock the Assets. I think it's something we need to look at. It's the old Lincoln story here, the answer is in the land. We can use that land to generate value. It's important. So why do you want to use those tools relate to public land? Well, it creates a lot of opportunities, all levels of government-owned land. How can you maximize the benefits that can be achieved from them? Government has direct control, so they can move a little more quickly than having to motivate the private sector. There's also the opportunity for cooperation across levels of government. The two governments working together, one might have policies and funding for subsidies for housing, for example, and the other may have the land. So if you get some cooperation, that'll help. You also might be able to employ underutilized assets, what we call sometimes as lazy land. Land is sitting there kind of in the backwaters and no one's using it. And sometimes governments don't even know the land that they own. And I'm talking about that even in the context of places like in Canada. Toronto didn't know the land they owned in a very burgeoning city. They didn't have good databases and so on and so forth. So one of the things that you can get from mobilizing these publicly owned lands is you get long-term benefits. A lot of the applications will create benefits that have benefits flow over time. Like if you can provide affordable housing, that housing benefit flows to social housing for a long period of time. When we talk about the objectives of why we capture land value, it's the last of these that really is the most important one here. To generate revenue for specific purposes comes into play here. We don't want to generate this revenue for general budgets. We don't want to use it to finance the second thing of capital expenditures. Sometimes you have development charges or you have area charges for transit lines. You're then trying to fund specific or reimburse specific kinds of infrastructure. Often in public land, you kind of get some general benefits, such as things like affordable or social housing. And when you look at the kinds of tools that are available, again, tools are labels here in land value capture. They're applied in a broad variety of different ways. One of my favorite tools is public land leasing. What I want to talk about and give a couple examples about today are what might be called either public-private partnerships or land readjustment. They could be called either because they have a little bit of each in their elements. And conclusionary zoning comes into play as well when you're looking at affordable housing and social housing being created. What are the challenges? One of the biggest challenges is identifying the assets. Do the governments know what they own? Can they really identify what land they have? And you don't ask just for surplus lands, or government agencies won't give it up, but you want to know all the land's available. And then once you have the land, what are the appropriate tools? Which tools do you use? Do you use public land leasing? Do you use kind of public-private partnerships? Do you use land readjustment? And then how do you structure those tools? Because each tool can be applied in a variety of different ways. And how are they implemented? Is there someone looking at those things? And again, for land value capture to take place, you have to have the usual preconditions. Legislation is permitted. Market conditions of values have to be increasing. You need some public understanding, acceptance you're going to use it, and of course, political will and support to make it happen. All those preconditions apply to these issues as well. And public land leasing, I just want to highlight this quickly. It's one of my favorite tools. I think it's underutilized in our context in Toronto and other places in North America. There's broad applications that we know about in Amsterdam and Hong Kong. Lincoln has a complete book on these topics in many cities and many jurisdictions. Some of the more interesting applications in North America are in Boston, the Massport lands on the waterfront. London Crossrail used land leasing, was very successful in generating revenue to help make that successful and that transit system. Very great land value capture tools on Crossrail. In Toronto, it's been done in waterfront Toronto, an area called the West Don Lands, where they actually lease land to a developer, gave lease rates, so a certain percentage of units for affordable housing. And they've got a program they do in public-private partnerships called Housing Now at the city. Cape Town's done it as well with their land release program. And I'm looking at examples that are non-Latin American, given the rest of the panel. I'm leaving them to Latin American examples, because I know you're covering a lot of those. So I've deliberately not included those along the way. Now, the programs I really want to focus on as the model are the model of programs to try and build social or rebuild social and affordable housing. These could either be called P3s, public-private partnerships, or land readjustment. There are elements of both involved in them. The three quick cases I want to point out are in Toronto, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, a project called Regent Park, and Boston began to move into this, the Boston Housing Authority, particularly the Charlestown project. And Cape Town has done some of this, not redevelopment of projects, but using public land to have a joint development on it. And one of the ones that's highlighted, of course, is the Salt River one that has a combination of both and has been approved last year and is moving forward. Regent Park one was the first one. And here I just want to, I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to give you an idea about Toronto Community Housing or the Social Housing Agency, how significant and important it is. It has 110,000 plus tenants, 2,200 buildings. Majority of the buildings are 50 plus years old. And of course, they're all crumbling. They had huge backlogs and deficits and repairs. They had to try and find a way to rehabilitate or rebuild all the housing. So one of the projects called Regent Park, they developed a program and a strategy that they would actually work with a developer, give the developer some of the land to build market housing. The developer in turn would rebuild all the social housing on a one-for-one basis and provide other community benefits. So you could call it a public-private partnership. You could call it land readjustment because they gave some of the land to the developer. So it could fall into either category. What it's called doesn't make any difference. The success and the impact is what's important. This is a list of all the projects, and the one I'm talking about is the bottom one, the Regent Park project that was built in 1948. It had 283 social housing units, all being rebuilt, plus 5,400 new market housing units, the proceeds for which the developer using to redevelop the land. And again, if we look at this, it's 69 acres right in downtown Toronto. Land values have increased significantly, so the value was there. This was built in 1948, and that the revitalization plan began way back in 2003. And that's what illustrates the complexity of these projects. This is just a timeline showing that this began in 2003, and only now are we building the fourth and fifth phases over 20 years later. So these things have a long gestation period, large-scale projects, but they can work and be very successful. The other hallmark of these plans is that they had significant public participation involved. This is a very multicultural area, so they had public participation in many languages, and people were guaranteed the right to come back and guaranteed housing in the meantime. So everybody had the right to one of the units they wanted to come back. They're relocated in the meantime. They had the choice of coming back or staying in their new location. In addition to the new housing, we also had other broader social benefits that came in. The developer built an aquatic center, an arts center, child and youth hub, a central park, new retail facilities were needed in the area that also guaranteed jobs for residents in there. And they also required the construction trades to do apprenticeships for the residents. So they had some skill training as well. So subsidized ownership opportunities also existed in some of the market housing. Some people could move in from rental to market housing. They're given some benefits to move in if they had some resources and had the ability to come forward. So that's the kind of example from Toronto. In Boston, they started a little later, but when Boston did that at first, or Toronto did that at first, there were no examples in the US where we actually saw this taking place on a broad basis. And then a few years later, I began to learn that the Boston Housing Authority was looking at the same kinds of applications. And their first project there is called One Charlestown. If we look at the projects there, there's Whittier that did a joint development of some type, One Charlestown, and then also McCormick. And Whittier was done a little bit different process because it had subsidies from the federal government. The others are trying to be self-financing, as was the Regent Park kind of application. One Charlestown is fairly old, built in 1941. Again, 1,094 units, all the social units being rebuilt, and 2,100 new market units. Again, working with a developer on this project to have this value capture, readjusting the land, giving them some land for private sector development. This is the model of what they're looking at, total of 2,700 apartment units. We saw a number being for low-income, mixed-income people. And again, the development taking place in a similar fashion to the Regent Park project. Again, this one had a fairly long timeline as well. It began being studied in 2014. And in this particular case, we began to see the shovel in the ground only last year, in June of last year, moving forward. So again, fairly long gestation period, not as long as the Regent Park example. Now, we did a project. We had a number of people in town. We did this at our research center. We had a seminar where we had somebody from the Boston Housing Authority, somebody from the Toronto Housing Authority, and somebody from DAG, the head of DAG, talking about what they're doing in Cape Town. It's a little different there because they don't have old public housing projects. There's a lot of land sites they want to deal with on a public-private partnership basis. Again, they didn't have the same issue about relocating the tenants, but in some cases they had informal settlements. So they did have still issues with relocation. They still had broad public participation. So again, this is just a brief overview of the example in Cape Town, where again, they had a lot of legislation in place they could rely on. And here they're looking at locations in downtown Toronto where there's TOD opportunities, affordable housing needs, and a number of needs for social housing. And in this particular case, again, it's been a fairly long gestation period of getting this up and running. If we look at this, this began to move forward and was approved, one of the projects, in October 9th, 2023. Here we have a particular site called the Pickwick site that has 1,800 units that have been approved, a mixed-use development, 840 social housing units. Now, you want to refer to it. So the common elements of all three cases are that there's strong public participation, there are tenant committees involved, there's establishment of strong planning and development principles that were required to make the project successful. So planning was an important component. Their protection of existing residents, the right to return, land value capture based on the market housing units going forward. They all had complex procurement RFP proposals. So again, you have to find developers who are willing to do this, and sometimes they need to be adjusted to get the right bidders in, and you wanted the right projects and the right developers involved. They all have some additional community benefits being provided, and most of them had false starts and resets. In other words, they started sometimes to redo RFPs, sometimes they had to readjust things with the community, sometimes the politicians wanted to change things. So again, there was a lot of changes going on through the process. And in cases of both Toronto and Boston, they needed a little injection of government funding. The city had kicked in a little funding because it didn't quite work the way it was intended, but the city said, well, we're getting really long run benefits, so we'll kick in a little extra money and make the project work and successful. So it wasn't totally self-financing. So just in conclusion, if I can go back, some of the key considerations are that the permitting and pre-zoning is very important. That has value to the private sector. Getting the land that's already ready to go with the planning approvals in place is necessary. The timing of the development is important in terms of the market, because unless the private sector has a strong market, they're not going to sell their product and be able to deliver the public benefits. And also you have to think about the response of the neighboring community, not only the community that's being displaced and relocated and coming back, but also the surrounding neighborhood. That was a big issue, particularly in the Charlestown area of Boston, because they're increasing the density of that development quite significantly. The procurement and structuring the RFP is very important. How do you structure that? One of the questions is it fixed of what the developer has to provide, or do you participate in some of the revenue stream? In other words, is the revenue shared with the public sector, or do you have a fixed amount you're getting for the public benefits? The alternative approaches to capturing land value, we're talking about this being in-kind, the provision of the housing by the P3 partner. In the land given to the private sector, it could either be sold to them as part of a transfer or could be leased. There's options in that. Go back to the land leasing provisions. And one of the questions is, does the public sector have an equity participation in the market sale units? There's more risk involved, but the uptake's greater. That's one of the questions that most of these agencies wrestle with back and forth and how you deal with that. So here's a model that has significant opportunities for long benefits, social benefits of facilities, the housing grants sustain over a number of years, but there are a number of challenges and considerations of getting it accomplished. So that's the cases I wanted to present. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Right on time, and I want to congratulate you. I was afraid, given the 3 cases and quite substantive amount of analysis you made, it's interesting that you bring Boston, Cape Town, and Toronto, and showing that some issues that we can find common ground. And one of the things that became clear is the preconditions that needs to be in place for these things to succeed and the tools to be used. So you made a question at a certain moment, how do we structure these tools? I think we can explore that further in the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now let me give the floor now to Martin. Martin, you have the floor. David, can you close your
There you go. Very good.
screen? Yeah,
Let me
thank
see.
you.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a 2-page note. So let me see if I can share that. If I could, can you see that?
Yeah, if you can put it in
I
a
have to
presentation.
widen this thing a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah, increase the size now
Yeah.
in that little thing underneath on the right side that you put the plus, and then you
Yeah, let me see on the right side. Let me see that.
underneath the right that you have the plus and
Yeah. That's too
yeah.
much.
Okay, now move the screen
All right. Is it okay?
a little bit bigger. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
Well,
Thank you.
for the invitation, for Cynthia and all the folks promoting that. It has been so far a pretty joyful and rich discussion. So let's see. This is the last session. Let's see how we go there. Well, and let me start saying that cities are growing up in all senses, but particularly with the verticalization in high densities, observed in most cities, even in the middle-sized cities. It's amazing how you go to middle-sized cities and there are all these high rises already in the middle of it, or sometimes not even in the middle. So this is happening. And that may be one of the explanations, or an additional explanation, why among all these latent-based tools, charges to building rights is really gaining traction. And it's becoming something very attractive to a planner. And this may be also being fueled by the often spectacular increases of values of the lands benefited by the often unabashed, generous public investment supporting such densities. So in other words, and I would like to highlight this idea that it is public action in general that generate the conditions for higher density. And higher density means, as we will see, more land. Or more explicit, in a more explicit parlance, the formidable givings that is associated to that of publicly created land. And in Brazil, it has been known as solo criado in the past, or created land, to the lucky owners in these blasted areas. So one of the interesting legal consequences of that is that created land should be rightful and be understood as a public asset, is a community patrimony. And this it's not everywhere that people understand that additional development rights are land owned by the public, period. It's a public patrimony. So this has also a number of very interesting consequences. One of them is that when you give access to other users, particularly private users, to that land that is a public asset, it's not a tax, it's not a fee, it's a market transaction. It's a buying and selling, as simple as that. And that is also very important because it follows that, contrary to many arguments, that there is of this fallacy that the payment for additional building rights is not a tax. It's not a tax. It's a market transaction. It's a buying and selling transaction. You cannot tax something that you don't own, that is not your patrimony. It's only when you incorporate the building rights into your patrimony or your private patrimony that you can be taxed. So that precedes the possibility of taxing. Once you incorporate, you're going to be paying property taxes and all other taxes that falls on that, but not the additional building rights. This is simply an acquisition from the private to something that is publicly owned that is being sold at values that are established in many ways. In other words, a tax, I said that already. This means also that the selling of building rights is non-tributary. This is a very important feature of that, particularly now that we have these buzzwords hanging everywhere. That's no more taxes. We can't address the enormous backlog of public urban investments in social housing with more taxes. And once you put this as more taxes, it's a dead end already from the start. That's why these instruments should be looked. It should be appreciated in a different way if we want to use them successfully. So moreover, and there is some empirical evidence, as we all know, it's very hard to do with to assess on the value of these additional building rights and how these policies play on the city. But the embryonary, I would say, investigations, empirical investigation for that, because this is extremely hard to find natural experiments that you could be doing with the before and after you implement these policies, and what happens with the land prices, what happened with the level of activity, what happened with land uses, and so forth. But the information that we have so far, and most of them are basically supporting the existing theory, and that is, it's not, it has no major inflationary, in other words, it does not transfer. These additional building rights charges are not transferred to the final prices, and it's not affecting the level of activity. And this is research being done for the case of São Paulo. That's perhaps one of the most successful cases, but it's now, as I would suggest later, is being replicated in many or being disseminated in many other cities of Brazil. And moreover, it does not have a major impact on the property tax, although there are some worries about that. That the fact that the introduction of the charge on building rights may have a negative capitalization effect on land prices, and that this could in principle affect the property taxes. In addition, also, and this is some of the fire friendly fire that these tools are getting from, particularly from the left now, that is gentrifying, and it's not. It has been shown, particularly in the case of São Paulo, that is a very gentrifying city, but that the use of the resources collected from the charges of building rights, and we're talking about millions and millions, and actually the potential for the São Paulo is basically collecting something like $180 something million a year just on selling your building rights. Not even, and this is not including the major CPACs applications that are on urban redevelopment, and that collected billions of dollars already. Similarly, the evidence, at least for the case of São Paulo, confirms the redistributive, the Robin Hood kind, if you may, use of these funds that are mostly where and for what is being used. And it's being used for social housing, it's being used for social investments in infrastructure and things like that. So sadly, it's all allegedly going well, that if we looking prima facie on that, it should be a no-brainer. But, and here's the point that I want to make in this presentation, this is not exactly what we're feeling. There is a sense of the current trends with the application of these tools are kind of frustrating. And in effect, this is through the increasing assimilated although it has been increasingly being assimilated in national and local urban development legislation, and many countries are introducing that, the implementation itself has been troublesome, to say the least, in most places. And I'll give you some examples. In the case of Peru, that has passed, is one of the most recent cases of passing a national law in 2021. It's still, it's called the Law of Sustainable Urban Development Law. And this is inspired in the case of Brazil and Colombia. It's a kind of taken from both sides. But there is this law hasn't been regulated as yet. And probably it won't be that soon. There has been a major obstacle for the generation to the generation of real estate projects. This has been argued by some powerful entities there in Peru. The case of Belo Horizonte, it's a city also that introduced the citywide basic FAR of 1 for the whole city, and this is what is being recommended in general. The case of Recife and many other places are beginning to do this in Brazil. But 50% of that is already, it was already watered down for 50% of the on the contribution to further what is added in building rights. And after that, another 25% has been also added to as a discount on the if it's applied on central areas of the city, and of 30% in addition to that if you pay it out front. So at the end of the day, you're barely collecting 17.5% of the excessive full contribution that may be even undervalued given the numeraire that is, the base value for the given by the cadastre for a square meter of land in different zones. The case of São Paulo is also back there, whereas a very successful case, and some in the larger it is, but in 2014, when they introduced the citywide basic FAR of 1, it was also added a division by the amount of the maximum FAR that is being used. In other words, if and this was to incentivize the investments on the areas of where the maximum FAR was higher. This is around public transit areas. Incentivize them to actually use or to densify them. The more you densify, the least you pay for the square meter. So if you're using an FAR of 4, this means that you will be dividing whatever you have to pay by 4. So this again waters down. This is one of the reasons why you're simply getting it. Even with that, São Paulo is collecting something like $183 million a year with this instrument. But You can imagine that the potential is almost $1 billion a year. Well, there is some interesting evidence that our friend Paulo Sandrani is finding using the data that is available also for on these issues that the created land that developers buy are typically lower than they would have to buy if there was no instrument like that. In other words, the developers are actually getting a bargain with these instruments in the case of São Paulo. And this is normally not very often been told. Another similar innocuous incentives, and this is something also very troublesome, is that it's a things that have been introduced with some window dressing on the for that, as for instance for green buildings. Developers are selling green buildings already with a premium because it's a green building. So this is a completely innocuous charge or factor that you add to discount on the whatever that's being collected for the additional building rights when people are already willing to pay for that. Why would you do that? Social housing, the same thing. There are certain areas that is zone almost that can where the highest and best use is already for social housing. Why would you give you an incentive of that if it's already zoned on that and people are interested in doing that? In other words, the thing is, how do we explain this conundrum? And this is really what brings me in this to this discussion here. And this is
Martin, 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. I'm finishing. This is it's a matter of why is that we have that on one hand a no-brainer instrument that has everything to be the right instrument, the right moment for the right circumstances, and in practice has been quite frustrating. How do you explain that? Is that issues of ideological revisionism or calling for there are discussion of public intervention nowadays, the need of public intervention. It's a matter of inherent or still prevailing promiscuity between landowners and developers, and I mentioned this in the previous session. Is that a matter of public officials' prosaic myopia or misinformation and inertia, or it's simply a matter of outright ignorance, turbinated perhaps by the fallacy of and naivete of the so-called conventional wisdom on these issues? Should the latter be the prevailing factor, as I believe it is, and hereby my point with this presentation, a major effort should be made by all, and we were speaking here to a United Nations Habitat is promoting this, and many other entities are promoting it, this kind of discussions and tools, even in policies, is in this event and others in the relevant places, to promote an intensive educational and public clarification campaign on the facts of life of these charters of building rights. So this is the main point. Habitat in tutti quanti here. It's a call for building capacity. I think this is a major impediment to explain this conundrum that I'm this case of a certain frustration of an instrument that has everything to be the instrument is not being played sufficiently well, or it's not well below its potential. That's my point. Thank you for your time of listening and let's hope for the discussion on this.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for bringing the groundbreaking experience of São Paulo, where shifts and changes in floor area as part of large urban operations that the municipality carried out in different parts of the city, allowing discharge of additional building rights, including doing, let's say, auction of these development rights certificates, which allow the municipality to mobilize more than $2 billion through these operations. So it's quite an incredible case that has been, as you said, inspiring many other cities in Brazil. Thank you for that. Now let me immediately pass the floor to Andres Blanco. You have the floor, Andres. Go ahead.
Thank you, Claudio. Let me share my presentation here. Can you see it?
Yep.
Yes. Can you put on presentation mode, please?
I already did.
No.
No?
No, not yet.
Oh, no. I'm so good with Teams, but the bank doesn't use
You
Zoom.
might have
Now?
opened the different window. That happens often. So for
Is it?
you, it's on presentation mode, but for us, it's not in presentation mode.
Put it on
Yeah.
slideshow.
Slideshow. Yeah, that's what I'm
Slideshow.
doing.
So why don't you get out and choose again?
Yes.
From the beginning. Now?
No.
Still not
No.
good.
Yeah. Get out of your share screen
Okay.
and select again and select the PowerPoint not open. Just the window where the PowerPoint is.
This is the window where the PowerPoint is. Now I did that.
Okay, now put it on presentation mode. Click on that little window on
Yeah,
the right
already
side.
did. No?
No, it's not coming.
Well, let's see if I can do it in
We
with-
all see it anyway, so it's okay.
yeah, let's try. Sorry, let's try if I can do it with the PDF. And if not, then I'll start, okay?
Okay.
Sorry about that. Again, I'm a pro with Teams. But Zoom is a new thing for me. Okay, so let's see. That better?
Yeah, now it's there.
Excellent. So my presentation is gonna be a little bit different, but it's gonna be very related to the previous three. In a way, this is like a personal, institutional, bureaucratic journey trying to overcome our team's frustration, trying to answer the conundrum that Martin posed in his presentation. I'm going to talk about three initiatives that we launched in the bank, trying to promote a public policy agenda related to land value capture and land-based financial models in Latin America and the Caribbean, and three lessons that we learned from that. So it's going to be three initiatives, three lessons. It's going to be one every 5 minutes, Claudio. So I'm going to try to be very on point starting from now. So the first is going to be the first initiative that we did was to try to collect some case studies in the region and use that to promote a discussion and public policy dialogue to get public officials to understand these tools and to try to do something with them with the support from the Inter-American Development Bank. Then another initiative that we did was to try to start with a method for them to see what's the best option and what the best tool according to their urban project or the territorial project. And then finally, a third initiative that we did try to focus on implementation. So the first one, this is something that many of you know because many of you work on this, Martin, Eduardo, Rece, Paolo Sandroni. This is in 2012, 2014. We had a big team trying to collect information about 17 case studies in 5 countries. You can see them there. I mean, it's in the publication. My point is going to be, it's not about the cases per se, but in the difficulty of creating policy out of case studies. So it doesn't matter if you cannot see this very well, it's just to show the variety of cases that we use. We had cases from Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Uruguay, cases related to revitalization, infill, preservation, upgrading, greenfield development. And what we did after like conducting a very thorough study of each case was try to get some theory, some as David was saying, some common elements, some preconditions for these cases to mean something for other countries or other cities or other public projects. And it was very difficult because the difference between each case and each regulation and each country and each city and each specific location made very difficult to create theory or create universal values out of that. So in the end, we ended up studying very well the context, and I know that you cannot see this, but again, it's not the point. The point is that each context in each country, in each city, is not alien to the results and the process of implementation of that specific case study. So it's very difficult for a specific case study to say something about a different context. So in the end, we ended up like using these to mobilize dialogue. Yes, we did that. We create awareness. Yes, we did that. But in terms of new projects or new technical cooperation that we could implement out of these, the result was very limited. So we learned that, okay, we need to start where we are. Each case is going to be very different. Case studies are good and they are important, but just as a matter of inspiration, it's going to be very difficult to start from there. So we said, okay, let's try something different, very in the line of what David was showing us, and say, let's start with a method. So in this case, second initiative that I wanted to show, we started, and this is a different publication that we work with David Better and others. We tried to start with a categorization. So instead of going case by case, we said, okay, let's create 4 categories. 4 because that was our number. You can like think about, for example, one of the or categories is tax increment financing. Some people don't think that that's a land-based finance mechanism. So it's okay. It's just a matter of creating a menu of options. So we said in one category, you have betterment levies. In another one is exactions and building right charges. Another one is the third one, tax increment financing. And then the fourth one that Claudio was mentioning, and also David, land readjustment. And what we did was to try to create like a typology of cases when these specific mechanisms work. When do they work in terms of the type of development? When do they work in terms of the scope of the land value capture, of the timing of the resources need, in terms of the preconditions, as David was saying. So here, just to give you an example, we said we study some cases of land readjustment, and we say this is a very good tool, but it requires a lot of sophistication in the legal framework. For example, tax increment finance is very good where it works, but it requires a lot of sophistication in financial markets. So with that, we try to create a menu of options that then, combined with a method, would provide, that was our hope, would provide the public official with an idea of what to use, when, and where. So we created a methodology to start with the project description, then defining the impact area, then calculating the current value of the land, then calculating the impact of the project, and doing some very initial pre-feasibility analysis. that allow the public officials to identify and design identify the best instrument of land value capture for that specific case. So it's in the publication. I can send you the link later. The methodologies, we try to do methodologies that work with the lowest amount of data, because we know our cities, and we know that in many cases we work with few data points. And we tested this method in 2 cases. The first one was a city in Mexico called Jalapa, yeah, and it's about the commission of a railway. And the second one is a city in Guatemala called Quetzaltenango. It was about the building an intercultural center in the city. So we presented this to the public officials. We created dialogue. We created awareness. They were very excited. We proposed following up. We proposed some technical cooperation from the bank to do this. By the way, the projects themselves were product of technical cooperation from the bank through the Sustainable Cities Initiative. But in the end, nothing happened. So what we realized then is that it ain't over till it's over. We need to work in the implementation. So we started to say, okay, how could we build momentum for this type of projects to happen? And we tried different approaches. We talked about different things, and then we started to think about this as Jaime Lerner would say, innovar es comenzar. So we said, okay, let's try to do something that gets the ball rolling, that starts the process. So we said, let's create the Cities Lab. This is something that we work on in 2018, 2019 is still doing some projects with different partners from the Inter-American Development Bank. And essentially we said here, let's implement, let's try to move implementation through experimentation. Let's explore an idea, let's experiment on that idea, evaluate, and with that evaluation, let's move the political process so we can get to the scaling up and then communicate. So we did a bunch of projects. We had essentially 10 projects per year, 10 pilots like this one. This is a project of tactical urbanism in Panama, essentially converting a road in a pedestrian area with very tactical things, and see what happens. So we increase the public space, we increase the pedestrian traffic, people love it, people wanted the intervention to be permanent, like the commercial uses in the area said that their commercial activities improved, the security improved. We had an agreement with the Waze to calculate or to estimate the impact on traffic. There was no impact on traffic, so everything was perfect. But so we explored, we experimented, we evaluated, we communicated, but we didn't scale up. You see the pictures there, 2 years after that, there's no painting, everything is broken. It didn't move through an implementation phase of a project. So I'm still working on my lesson learned here and trying to understand this conundrum and what can we do. But essentially, I'm thinking that we need to combine everything. We need to combine the project approach with institutional strengthening. We work, for example, with the Mexican government in the implementation of the land use law of 2016. We know that we need to experiment. We know that we need to learn from cases, but in the end, everything is very situational with this type of projects. So what we need is some flexibility. Like Eisenhower would say, rely on planning, but never trust plans. We can have this planning and this perfect idea of a project, but then in the end, this is everything. This is going to happen in the specific situation and the specific process of implementation. So I don't want to read this, but essentially, and with this I'm finishing, Claudio. But essentially, I found this quote this is an excellent book, by the way, Lawrence Friedman's Strategy. And he said that the strategy, and I'm thinking about planning per se, should we thought as moving to the next stage. That's it. He said, as a practical matter, just move to the next stage that is realistic. And then from there, work in the next stage, and from there, work in the next stage. Of course, you need to have a directionality, a point in which you want to reach. But implementation of these projects is going to be something very flexible and very context-based. So I know that that's not new, but again, it's the conundrum that Martin is proposing for this discussion is something that I feel that we will need to solve case by case, in a case by case basis. That's my presentation. Thank you, Claudio.
Thank you very much, Andres. And I start with a quick wrap up with you, because you actually spoke about 3 cases and the challenges of bringing on experimentation cases to scale. You argue that there are some common elements, common conditions that needs to be in place: regulations, the location, the institutional environment, the capacity, and the requirements in terms of finance and legal instrument. Actually, what you showed us was a taxonomy of land value capture in Latin America in order to actually inspire and allow the bank to okay, so, sorry, my God. I couldn't close the 15 minutes. I'm so sorry. But quite interesting, because you showed us how the bank actually made an effort to promote initiatives, inspire its counterparts in the country, in the member states, city partners, and try to bring it to scale. You put a very I would say controversial questions, and with your conclusion, can we use these cases to actually inspire and actually go to the next level? I think that when Martin made his presentation and referring to the case of São Paulo, we see that when a particular case, in this case, charging the additional building rights and creating an instrument, and the institutional, financial, legal instrument backed by the statute of the city, particularly the urban operation, allow the municipality and many other cities in Brazil to actually mobilize a huge amount of resources. Rio de Janeiro, for example, capitalized itself with more than $2 billion using a particular model and instrument that is now widely used in many cities in Brazil to finance the infrastructure improvement in the Olympics. And David also brought us, 3 cases in different contexts, quite diverse, Boston, Toronto, and Cape Town. And you showed us in the end that trying out in Panama and looking at other cases, and how do you actually move from pilot to actually mainstream that kind of approach. And I think David showed us one element that was very important, which is the timing. It takes time, and you have a timeline for that transformation, and then you have the elements, that the preconditions. He mentioned the political will, the legal backing, the institutional capacity, and then using the knowledge and experience to move to the next level. And Bautista showed quite clearly that in Argentina, with a very important legal initiatives, creating the code and the land use planning and regulation, and involving different levels and different interventions, including slum upgrading and urban rehabilitation, he was able to show us that indeed, using the strategy of densification and creating what he called higher building rights to this municipal law that was adopted, it was able to generate quite a lot of resources. So I think we got with this panel a very interesting conclusion, looking back on the previous panel, which puts together a certain narrative that it's possible for us to actually adopt land-based finance in various ways, and having these, I would call the inspirational levels. When I looked at the presentation of Helen in the previous panel, we were there many years ago sharing experiences with different tools and what they are achieving in Cape Town with a lot of hard working, consistency, persistence, capacity, radio program, information. It was possible for them to do a very transformational tool in Cape Town. So I would like to put a question to all of you, and then we can use the same order. First question is, what are the conditions necessary to make it work? That you can actually mainstream this like some cities in Brazil are doing. It's just becoming part of the tools that municipalities are using for urban management. Now, what is that we need to do? And second, going to a scale to create the operations to actually finance, and that both Martin and David said that in the end, allowing even to produce social housing and create a more inclusive cities and not a segregated cities where the poor is put into the peripheries in the developing countries. So how do we go to the next level? So let me start with Bautista.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I believe that the answer, to be short and to leave space for the rest of the panelists, is that the central issue, to my viewpoint, is private-public relationship and confidence. Because one of the most important issues to promote development and to promote investment is public confidence. So I believe that is the quote of the answer.
Public confidence. Interesting. Let me pass on to David.
I set out some of the preconditions there, part of market preconditions as well. But I think there has to be an understanding and acceptance of it, both by the general public, by the politicians. And in some cases, if it's going to impinge on private land, you have to get the development community on side. And in some cases, if you're starting new, you also need someone who's a champion, someone who's going to push this forward. The champion could either be somebody from the bureaucracy, a policy person, or a champion could be a politician. I think that's very important, someone to carry the torch and try and convince people, and someone has leadership in this area. In terms of the operation, the important thing there is to have the staff begin to understand, to develop how to develop the policy and how to implement the policy or tool. Because most policies fail in implementation, poor implementation, lack of funding, whatever. And I can speak very briefly the case of Cape Town, because I was the Lincoln Institute advisor to that project. When I first got there, the staff in Cape Town didn't understand what they call inclusionary housing rather than inclusionary zoning was. They were very naive. At the same time, I was working on a workshop in Toronto on their inclusionary zoning policy. Well, the people in Cape Town learned very quickly. They came along and they understood it, they knew how to do it, and they really developed great programs. The people in Toronto went into hibernation during COVID, and they got it all wrong. So again, I have that contrast of where the staff learned and learned from each other. The other thing in South Africa, they have peer-to-peer learning. So they're learning from each other, from the experiences. So that's an important component as well.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you for that. Martin.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Bautista and David just said. And I have to say that really appalled with the level of misunderstanding that still prevail in most public offices, and not only public office, but also in some of the associations of developers and all kinds of other stakeholders on the fundamentals of what this tool is all about. I know that, for instance, property tax is not that different. Property tax has been on for centuries already in most places in Latin America, but still people don't understand entirely the goodness of this tax, if you may. This is it's not different from any other taxes, but or any other regulations. There is there's a certain level of understanding that is basic, but the implementation of that, and this is really what I'm focusing on lately, and it has been characterized by a number of very tricky issues, and many of them are absolutely, I would say, even it's amazing that people will still raise some of these issues. And there are fundamental misunderstandings on what these instruments are and what the impact of these instruments are. For instance, the issue of acquired rights, the issue whether this is a tax or not, whether the issue whether this is inflationary, or the issue that even within, I can list a number of planners, some of them really of notorious planners with a lot of influence, still think that the charges on building rights, just to give an example, can be used as a land use regulation tool. I mean, this is completely insane. To see that the number of fallacies that still prevail in the public debate on these issues. So when I made a point that everything should be right in order for these instruments to be big winners, and in fact, it's not. It's not, because it's being done by chance, I would say, there has been in many places, like and in São Paulo, well thought ideas about how to do it, and they were extremely. I think that the way they implemented, or they managed to get to the point where the city established this base precedent of a citywide basic FAR of 1. For if you own land, you only own the right of building one time the size of the land, and this was done without any major demand in the courts. This was an incredible precedent, and not only in Brazil but internationally.
So Martin, what I'm trying to say,
I'm concluding. What I'm trying to say, we do have a major issue with building capacity, or people understanding what these instruments are really about. And I think we need to work on that.
Yeah, I think you coincide with David when he speak about understanding the fundamentals by the politicians, by the development community, getting a champion so that you actually overcome these misunderstandings that you highlighted, and also getting with this champion the public confidence that Bautista highlighted. So the ability of the public to actually convince the market that this is possible and is beneficial for everyone. Andreas.
Thanks, Claudio. Yeah, I totally agree with the previous three answers. is the issue of governance. So how we could create consensus and show that these policies work. I remember talking about this in different cities and countries, and some developers even say, I like this policy because it allows me some clarity that the infrastructure and the public expenditure is going to be there. So for them, if you explain this to them, they're going to be on board. The worst thing for a private developer or any other entrepreneur is uncertainty. So this is solving this problem of uncertainty. For the politician, is good because he will like see the project happening. The public is going to love it. But it's a question. The question then is how you create that consensus. And it's a matter of, I think, it's a matter of first creating the ecosystem in which this public policy work. So you need to create the stakeholders. You need to create the think tanks. You need to support all that infrastructure that is going to promote the consensus. You need to work on the capacity building. You need to be very flexible, each case by case. And I think that you say it, Claudio, you also need to be very patient because these things takes time. Everything really in terms of public policy, but especially in terms of urban public policy, it requires some moderation. So yeah, I think it's it comes back to capacity building and creating that ecosystem and stakeholders.
Thank you, Andres. I see that we do have some 5 minutes, and I would like to ask Cynthia in a while just to conclude the session for us. But I must say that the session was very rich with the number of cases. We started with Argentina in a city with 370,000 people in the great Buenos Aires area, in innovating, I would say, using legislation, densification, and generating resources to do quite interesting interventions, which I would say, is really promising and can provide feedback to other neighboring municipalities. And I think that David gave us a rich coverage of 3 cases of quite interesting systematic history that showing us that things started 2003 in Regent's Park, for example, and you see how long it took to actually made the transformation in the area. And I think this was very, very rich. And Martin brought us the Brazilian experience, which brings these tools to a scale never seen before. We're talking about billions of dollars, and the controversy about whether this is a tax, whether this is ripping off, causing inflation, or etc. And the resistance, the political resistance that was in the end also highlighted by David, that we need to work with the politicians to bring this understanding and the fundamentals. And I think, Andres, you highlighted that the difficulties one has to come from the inspiration to bring it to scale, and with all the efforts that the bank did with its partners and member states and city partners, and really going from experimentation to actually mainstream. It's not it's not so straightforward exactly by the problems you all highlighted in the end. As long as we do not do that capacity building, information, confidence. And I think the experience of DAG was in Cape Town was very, I would say, eye-opening in that sense, because they have been very consistent with communication, working with the local governments, with the province government, even going to radio to actually explain what things are. So I want to thank you all for was a very, very rich session where I think our audience, learned a lot, as I did, and I want to thank you all for this. And with that, I pass on the words to Cynthia, our master. Cynthia, over to you.
Well, first of all, as we conclude this insightful panel and discussion about land-based finance, I would like to take a moment to express my gratitude to all this panel, to all the experts in these panels, very good friends and experts of relevance in all the world. And to Claudio, who was an excellent moderator of the panel. And I found that your presentations and comments and the discussion was really very inspiring and raised very important topics and clarification, especially about implementation. But now to close, in this closing session, I want to invite Analia and also Jane Katz to bring their opinions and these closing words in here, and then I want to make some final comments. Okay.
Okay,
Fabulous. Well, thank you all on behalf of the World Bank campaign of Habitat. We are delighted for this amazing event. The whole day we have different so much knowledge to share, and I would like to wrap up this event to summarize some important topics. I think during the last session we have like a kind of global conclusions of the event. As all of you know, cities are evolving more faster than ever. And nowadays we have the lucky, the opportunity to have more evidence and technology to share this evidence. And this UTC is is giving us the opportunity to share worldwide this knowledge. And I would like to especially thank Martinez Molcar, who's a distinguished expert like all of you. He was the whole day with us, joining us and sharing comments through the UTC. So I would like to especially thank you for having you in this event. And of course, there are a lot of challenges. And as we talked previously with Cynthia, the reason of organizing this event is because I have a different background in political science and international relations. I'm mostly in communication. And I realized studying urban economy that this specific topic is a niche. It's a niche where urban planners they know about it a lot, but unfortunately, there are a lot of stakeholders that they don't know about it, and especially local communities. And that's something that came out a lot during this UTC. So I think that this is crucial to empower communities on the relevance of land-based finance, enabling them to request action from their local authorities, thereby initiating a bottom-up revolution in land value management. And I think that's something that came out also, the needs of more propaganda, well and good propaganda on this topic. And mainly with that in mind, we are going to do a report, but focusing our attention in social media and how are we going to disseminate this topic in some areas or with some communities and stakeholders that they are not aware of. And the World Bank campaign has mainly that role, with more than 300 organizations worldwide. And we work different topics on the cities, and having this opportunity to focus our attention on this tremendous tool for financing cities in a context of a lot of urban global crisis, and also climate change and armed conflicts, and at the same time, unfortunately, not having the local capacity to tackle all these urgent matters at the same time. So with that in mind, I would like to recognize different dimensions that also all of you, all the experts were mentioning during this day. The national and local collaboration and action as a huge support and tool, like a coordinated effort to that ensures resources and specifically working together in this specific instrument, like land-based capture, and also to increase the administrative capacity. And then I think in terms of that, there are now a lot of careers and more master's degree as well, giving specific tools in terms of that. And lastly, I would like to, and I think that Shane is going to came out, is going to go through all the specific topics, but I would like to deeply thank all the partners and all the people involved, because here was the University di Tella, all the Cynthia's team working together with us, with the different work partners like the International Union of Architects, the Global Urban Development, Smartly, St. Gallen University. So it was a huge effort to organize this event. So I would like to stop here and give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Jane.
Thank you. Well, I was going to start also by thanking our sponsors and all of the others who have spent a lot of time preparing for this conference and for this Urban Thinkers Campus, and all the work that's gone into some of these presentations. I hope that we will have all of the copies of the presentations available for you to review, because some of them went so fast that it had a hard time trying to take notes and scribble and work on my taking a picture through my camera on my computer. But I also want to thank Mark Weiss from GUD, who enabled me to be a participant today, and Analia and Cynthia, who I met for the first time. Is very glad to be on your panel, Cynthia, and seeing so many friends that I haven't seen in a long time online. I did want to also mention that that this isn't the end. And I think one of the main things that came out of this was that we need more education on the tools, that we need to have a space for learning, and that cities want to learn from each other, and that land is part of the environment. We need to do a better job on making sure that land is more important in all of these global conversations that we've been having. We've been engaged in the Summit for the Future. Housing's not even mentioned, and neither is urban. And so, as you mentioned earlier, Anna, that's something we really need to work on and make sure that we are promoting these and educating all of the participants and all of the different sectors on this. And I've been working closely with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction in their stakeholder engagement mechanism. I think one of our panelists said everything's very top down, but we've been making sure that we have a bottom up approach with stakeholders that are engaging in this effort with climate, and also the interactions and the linkages with land issues and with housing issues and with the urban sector in general. So we've had a long day. We started early this morning, so I'm not going to go through every single panel. I just want to thank everyone for your participation and for all the work that's gone into this. And we'll be reporting back to the World Urban Campaign. As Analia mentions, I hope that at the World Urban Forum, we'll be able to share a lot more about this effort as well. And for those of you who are not everyone, but if you want to join, the Global Land Tool Network is next week going to be having another session that is going to look at some of the housing and some of the land tools, and also focusing on land-based financing to see where the next steps lead us. So I'm hoping that we'd be able to bring some of these conversations to that as well. And I can see that there are a number of people who have been engaged in that in the past. So I think I'll conclude because it's been a long day. So
okay, thank you very much. I add to your thanks to all the organizations that help to organize and participate in this event, to the speakers, to the people behind the screen, which are from the team from the university that worked very hard to put this in place. I took some notes, and I think that I want to review them with you, because we agree in that land-based finance is underutilized, and especially among low and middle-income countries. And we discussed what were the main reasons for this, and we discussed also how can these countries be supported in adopting and implementing land-based finance more effectively. We talk about, for example, the presentation from Africa emphasized the importance of multi-stakeholder dialogues, which are being very successful. You, Shane, talk about this land-based finance learning series, which also are being very, very important. South-South learning is highly another important issue that I think we need to stress, but also education, building capacity, data, more information. These concepts were repeated in all the panels as key. Requirements for successful land value implementation was strong management skills, understanding of land market conditions, comprehensive property monitoring systems, and fluent dialogue among various entities, and the champions also. But also we discussed issues about instruments and clarifying many misunderstandings and conceptual issues that are very important to build a common understanding of the main issues. For example, who pays and all the things that Martin raised in his comment. We talk a lot about, we have a panel about climate change and land-based finance with very interesting examples, and also we discuss the importance of understanding risk in land markets. And in this last panel, they raised very interesting comments about implementation, about context, how context is very relevant, and the issue of public confidence, capacity building, ecosystems, as Andres explains in his latest remarks. So we have a lot of information, a lot of very interesting insights, and we are going to prepare a video with all the information. We are going to put on the web all the presentations, and we are preparing a report which can be released in English and Spanish. So thank you for all.
If I may, I would like to say there was a concept that Geoffrey Payne said, land value sharing. And I love it. I think that changed also the approach of this all this topic that we'll be discussing during the day. So thank you, Geoffrey, also for sharing with us that concept. And well, thank you, Cynthia, for being a great local host of this event.
Okay, and thank you for all the participants and experts which we contact, and immediately they say, yes, I'm going to participate. Geoff, David, Claudio, Martin, Bautista, very, very happy to have the opportunity to see you here today.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.